Shelley Arndt was on the rebound after a bitter divorce.
She wanted to find something else.
And she found it with Darcy Veter Jr.
He's outgoing, fun personality. Yeah, good guy to be around.
Their romance smoldered for 14 years.
They were never married, but he was still just like a brother-in-law to us.
They would come over to our house for like family gatherings.
But then one family gathering turned into a tragedy.
The house is full of smoke, and I could hear my fire alarm.
Both my brother's bedrooms were fully engulfed.
The last thing I remember seeing was smoke billowing out.
Do you know if everyone's out of the house? No, they're not.
Darcy was still inside, much to Shelley's horror.
I had to hold her back, and I told her, if you go back in, you're just gonna die.
But investigators were soon asking, was the fatal fire a horrible accident?
A leather couch is pretty hard to ignite.
Or was it an unthinkable crime?
3 fires in 3 years is more than just coincidence.
Bremerton, Washington, February 23, 2014. It was a cold and blustery morning in this Navy town across Puget Sound from Seattle.
It was about 35 degrees. It was raining off and on. There was snow.
And around 4:45 a.m., in the pre-dawn darkness, multiple calls flooded into the Kitsap County 911 center.
Kitsap 911, what are you reporting? I've got a fire.
This is flaring up. Son of a bitch.
Windows are blowing out.
Within moments, multiple units were en route to the blaze. But would they make it in time?
Do you know if everyone's out of the house? No, they're not. Hurry.
When firefighters arrived minutes later, the house was totally engulfed in flames.
It was a very big fire. They had fire coming out the front of the building. They had fire coming out the basement area of the building.
16-year-old Spencer O'Neill was lucky to escape.
I barely remember anything because my vision was fuzzy and I was starting to lose. I lost a little bit of consciousness here and there. The last thing I remember seeing was smoke billowing out of the house.
But as the house's dazed and coughing occupants gathered on the lawn, they realized that someone was still missing.
My aunt was screaming and she kept saying asking where Junior was.
And when Autumn's aunt, 45-year-old Shelley Arndt, realized that her boyfriend, 37-year-old Darcy Veter Jr., was still inside the burning house, she rushed back toward the flames.
She was going in for Darcy, and I had to hold her back, and I told her, if you go back in, you're just gonna die. Flames were shooting out of every window, upstairs, downstairs. Everything was popping. You could just hear crackling, and it was crazy.
There was nothing that Shelley could do. Darcy Jr., the man she'd dated for the past 14 years, was gone. But was his death a tragic accident? Or, as the investigators would soon be wondering, was the fire the result of something far more sinister?
One of the ideas that we looked at was whether or not the fire was intentionally ignited.
Born in 1969, Bremerton native Shelley Covey and her sister Kelly were identical twins.
We are 9 minutes apart. So Shelley and I were really close when we were growing up. She was probably my best friend growing up. Basically did everything together.
And the two sisters became even closer when their parents split up.
They divorced when we were 12, and it was very difficult. I mean, I know my mom did the best that she could, but, you know, we took care of ourselves.
In fact, the sisters were so close that it was tough to tell them apart.
We would always play pranks on the teachers. One time we switched classes. I believe it was our math class, and we both got caught because we had a test that day, and she failed my test, and I aced her test, and that's how the teachers found out.
But as the twins entered high schools, their paths diverged.
She kind of changed her appearance. We both kind of did. Kind of went opposite because we were tired of looking alike.
In addition to looks, their personalities diverged too.
Shelley was a natural athlete, and she excelled in almost every sport that she did. Basketball, soccer, fast pitch, volleyball. She was really good in sports, and I was the cheerleader and smart in school.
And while Sister Kelly continued to study, Shelley spent more time hanging out with her friends.
She could party with the best of them.
But the party ended during her junior year when Shelley got pregnant.
We don't know who the dad is.
After giving birth, Shelley put the baby up for adoption, but the experience appeared to send the star athlete into a tailspin.
She never really said anything about really going to college or doing anything.
Instead, in December of 1987, soon after the adoption, she married a sailor she met at a dance club.
She was 18, barely out of high school.
Over the next few years in Bremerton, Shelley seemed to settle down. She and her husband had 2 children, both boys.
They rented a little duplex that my grandmother owned. So they had one side and I had the other side. And they were good together.
In 1991, the Navy transferred Shelley's husband to Hawaii. She and the kids followed, and Shelley soon gave birth to the couple's 3rd child. But with her husband often away at sea, her marriage fell apart.
Him being gone so much and her being with the kids, she was a stay-at-home mom. I think she got bored, and I think she wanted to find something else to do. She had had an affair.
And when Shelley's husband found out, their 10-year marriage wasn't just over. The fact that she'd been having an affair cost Shelley her children, the oldest of whom was only 9.
Her husband ended up with custody.
After the divorce, Shelley married the man she'd been having an affair with, but the new marriage lasted less than a year. And by 2000, Shelley was back in Bremerton alone.
She'd stayed with my mom for a while.
And it was while living with her mom and trying to put her life back together that the 31-year-old met someone new, Darcy Veter Jr. 7 years younger than Shelley, like a lot of blue-collar Bremerton, Darcy depended on the Navy for his livelihood, even if he wasn't in the military.
He worked for a maintenance company at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard.
And much like Shelley, the 24-year-old was living at home.
Darcy was living with his dad. They've always been together. So Darcy Sr. raised Darcy, and they've been living together forever, as far as I know.
Shelley met Darcy one night when she went bowling with her sister Kelly and Kelly's husband Sean.
We were on the bowling league together. It was a weekly bowling league.
Darcy bowled on another team, but that's how we all met each other, was through bowling.
And that night at the bowling alley, it wasn't long before Shelley noticed the young man in the next lane.
He's outgoing, fun personality. Yeah, good guy to be around. Very good bowler.
But while Shelley soon struck up a conversation with Darcy, she wasn't quite ready for a romance.
Shelley had just gotten out of a long relationship with a man, and so I think in the initial beginning it was kind of just a mutual kind of like friendship, I'll be there for you.
Although over the weeks and months that followed, the ace bowler and the former all-star athlete realized they had a lot in common.
He liked his sports, that's for sure.
Darcy was a huge Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Eagles. Those were his 2 teams. That's him, and I would argue over the Hawks and his Eagles every single weekend.
And after several months of hanging out at the bowling alley or the neighborhood sports bar, Shelley and Darcy started dating, and things quickly turned serious.
She moved in with Darcy and Pops, or Darcy Sr.
Soon, they told people they were engaged, though they never quite got around to saying, I do.
They were never married, but he was still just like a brother-in-law to us. He was an uncle to my kids.
He was a great guy, always came out, hang out, had a smile on his face all the time.
And for the next 14 years, they continued living with Darcy's dad, while Darcy worked at the shipyard.
He was actually a really hardworking guy. He wanted to get higher up in the shipyard.
Shelley pitched in too, working a series of minimum wage jobs.
Shelley worked at several different locations, at gas stations, that type of thing. I think she at one point even worked at a school.
She was a teacher's aide or some kind of office aide.
She also looked after Darcy's aging father.
She was around most, if not all the time, so if he needed to, say, the yard mowed or something like that, she'd do it for him.
On weekends and holidays, they'd bowl, go out with friends, or get together with Shelley's twin sister and her family.
They would come over to our house for like Christmas or big family gatherings.
Sometimes they would lend a hand around the house, like on Friday, February 21st. That afternoon, Shelley and Darcy dropped by to help her sister with a little home improvement chore.
Darcy and her came to the house because I needed help installing closet doors into the master bedroom, and my husband was stationed off in Japan at the time.
It was late by the time they got done, so Shelley and Darcy ended up staying the night.
The next morning, they all got up and they went to a local restaurant and had kind of a brunch, kind of gathering, hung out for a while, went back to Kelly O'Neill's house and hung out for the rest of the day, sort of a family, enjoying each other's company.
And at that point, Darcy had asked if they could stay another night.
But Darcy had no idea that one more night would be his last.
When I opened my doors, you could see the fire and the flame.
Coming up, fire investigators have a mystery to unravel.
The individual who died, why didn't they get out?
But does Shelley know the answer?
Is that a normal amount for him to drink?
Early on the morning of February 23rd, 2014, Shelley Arndt's sister was asleep in her bed when she woke up to terror.
I'm sound asleep, and the next thing I know is that my bedroom door gets flung open, and Shelley tells me that the house is full of smoke. I could hear my fire alarm.
What happened next was pure panic.
I just remember waking up about 4 o'clock, and it's my mom opening, slamming open my door. I don't even think she turned the handle. She just went right through it. Said, the house is on fire. We need to get out.
You could absolutely see nothing in front of you. I couldn't even see the kids. I knew they were in front of me, but I didn't know exactly where.
You're supposed to crawl, but it didn't happen just because we were all trying to get out of there so fast. We didn't know how fast it was going to spread.
Shelley, Kelly, and Kelly's sons made it out the front door. Kelly's daughter, Autumn, ran out through the garage.
I ran to the end of our driveway where my mom was, and we were looking at the flames, realizing that it wasn't a small fire, that it was almost in every bedroom. Both my brother's bedrooms were fully engulfed at that point, and then we could hear the dog barking.
His name was Chevy. He's a big St. Bernard.
He's bred to rescue, so he would have never left that house unless everybody was out of that house.
And that's when everyone realized that Shelley's boyfriend, 37-year-old Darcy Veter Jr., hadn't escaped the flames.
When we realized that Junior was still in the house, Shelley tried to go back in.
But her sister Kelly stopped her.
The whole upstairs, you could see flames shooting up. I was heartbroken, knowing that there's nothing you could do. Is a feeling of dread. Darcy and Chevy were gone.
And when the firefighters finally managed to get the blaze under control, they confirmed it.
We found Mr. Veter's body next to the family dog on the north end of the living room.
The firefighters came to me and told me, I want you to know that your dog is a hero. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because when they found Darcy, Chevy's mouth was around his wrist. He had drugged Darcy off our couch and had drugged him around the side of the couch by the fireplace. And that's where they died, and they died together.
Not that the news was much consolation for Shelley, still waiting anxiously outside.
Shelley was pacing, and she kept saying, Darcy's in there. Where's Darcy? Where's Darcy? Where's Darcy? As if she didn't know.
I don't know if she was in shock or bewilderment or what.
She was sobbing off and on. She would calm herself down for a couple minutes, and then she kind of started to go again.
And after sunup, when the coroner's team brought Darcy's remains out in a body bag, Shelley broke down completely.
They finally had to take her away, my grandparents did, because she tried to climb into the coroner's van.
And while the family did their best to calm Shelley down, Investigators from the fire marshal's office began the grim task of figuring out just how the fatal fire began.
When you have a fatality, it's a very complex investigation because we need not only to determine what caused the fire and where did it start, the circumstances with that, but what was it that kept the individual who died? Why didn't they get out with the rest of the people?
Although for the moment, determining just where and how the fire started would have to wait.
The fire department was still putting the fire out. Fire doesn't just go out when you spray the water on it. It takes a little while. The scene was unsafe to enter. We couldn't go in there without firefighting equipment and breathing apparatus.
So with firefighters at the scene still watching for hotspots and flare-ups, the investigators from the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office began interviewing survivors and the many neighbors who'd called 911.
Those people have valuable information about where the fire was when it was first discovered, where it wasn't when it was first discovered, how quickly it grew, and where it progressed.
According to the neighbors, the fire hadn't just progressed rapidly, it had practically exploded.
I heard some yelling, and then soon after I heard crackling and popping and snapping, and like windows crashing. And I ran to my daughter's bedroom window, and I looked out, and Kelly's home was engulfed in flames. There was no little to big. It was completely engulfed by the time that I heard the yelling to the time I went to the window.
And that matched what Kelly's daughter Autumn told the investigators.
By the time I got out, the flames were already up through the upstairs.
Oh, by the time you were outside?
When I got out, when I looked back, the whole upstairs was engulfed, so I didn't go back in.
According to Autumn and her mother Kelly, it was Shelley who woke everyone and got them out of the house.
I grabbed the three boys. Shelley was following behind me. Darcy stirred. And as soon as we got the boys out, we went back in to get my daughter.
And when investigators talked to Shelley, she said she thought one of the kids had gotten Darcy out.
He kept yelling at Junior to get up, and that's all I know, and he said he was right behind them.
But when it was clear Darcy hadn't gotten out, Kelly said her sister was beside herself.
I know Shelley tried to go back in the house, and that's when the flames were coming through all the windows, so we literally held her back. She would have gone in.
So why hadn't Darcy Jr. made it out of the fire? According to Shelley's sister, the reason probably had something to do with what Darcy had been doing before the blaze. Shelley's sister told the fire investigators that she'd taken Shelley and Darcy out to lunch the afternoon before the fire at a restaurant called the Cloverleaf.
That's kind of my payment for them doing the doors and the coming over, and we all piled into the Tahoe and we drove to the Cloverleaf and we had lunch.
And according to what Shelley told the investigators, during lunch, Darcy Jr. had started drinking.
Junior was drinking Jack and Coke.
Okay. And how much Jack and Coke?
He had 3.
But he hadn't stopped there.
We left the Cloverleaf about 3:34 o'clock in the afternoon. They wanted to stop on the way down at Walgreens and get, I think they bought an 18-pack or something. They bought some kind of beer down at the store, and then we just went back up to my house.
Did you go anywhere else?
No.
Okay. And then so how'd the night progress?
We just sat there bull crapping, and drinking.
And by 11, when Kelly's daughter Autumn got home from work, Darcy had gone through the 18-pack.
I got home and they all were, they were having fun, they were drinking, they were being loud, and so I stayed up for a little bit. I took my aunt down to the store to go get some more beer.
At around midnight, Shelley's sister and her niece had gone to bed, and soon after that, according to Shelley, she and Darcy had settled in to spend the night on the living room sofa.
Who went to bed first?
We all pretty much went to sleep 5 minutes apart.
Although according to what Shelley's niece told the investigators, Darcy didn't so much go to sleep as pass out.
Darcy, he was pretty drunk. He was incoherent pretty much. He could talk, but he wasn't making a lot of sense.
And that was understandable if Shelley's account of his alcohol consumption was accurate.
How much beer do you think he drank?
Probably a case and a half, maybe 2 cases.
Okay. Is that a normal amount for him to drink?
Yeah, or more. Really? Okay.
A case or two of beer may have been a normal night's drinking for Darcy, but it had apparently cost him his life.
He was pretty intoxicated, so usually when he gets that way, he's just out.
And the autopsy results agreed with Shelley's assessment.
The toxicology report on Darcy indicated that he had a 0.26 blood alcohol level. That's 3 times the legal limit.
In his drunken state, it appeared that there was no way that Darcy could have dragged himself to safety when the fire began.
The coroner's office confirmed that Mr. Veeder died of smoke inhalation.
So perhaps Darcy's death was a tragic accident, the result of his intoxication. But one question still remained. What sparked that fatal blaze? Coming up, the fire marshal has a theory about the fire's origin.
We tested it to see whether it could be easily ignited with just a regular lighter.
And the sheriff's office makes a suspicious discovery.
3 fires in 3 years is more than just coincidence.
By the afternoon of February 23, 2014, it had barely been 12 hours since the devastating fire that ripped through the Bremerton, Washington home of Shelley Arndt's sister, Kelly.
It happened in the early morning hours. There were a number of people in the house asleep when it happened, including 3 children.
But only one person had died. Shelley's boyfriend, 37-year-old Darcy Veeder Jr.
She was inconsolable. You couldn't even touch her. She was crazy, a sobbing mess.
And while Shelley grieved, investigators with the Kitsap County Fire Marshal's office tried to determine the cause of the fatal blaze.
Before we can decide what started the fire, we have to determine where the fire started. And then once we've determined where the fire started, we're going to look for possible ignition sources.
And based on his initial walkthrough, the fire marshal suspected that the blaze began in the home's basement.
We saw heavier fire damage of the structural components of the building actually being burned downstairs. We observed patterns upstairs that were also consistent with the fire traveling from downstairs up to other portions of the house.
Which was strange, according to Shelley's sister.
There was no reason whatsoever for anybody to be downstairs because before Sean was being shipped to Japan, we had started remodeling down there. So there wasn't carpet. The bathroom was torn up.
Even stranger, the burn patterns appeared to spread outward from an old leather couch stored in the corner of the room, which seemed suspicious to the fire investigators.
Leather couches are pretty resilient. It's hard to ignite them without a substantial heat source, things like cigarettes. They're pretty resilient to ignition from cigarettes, sparks, things like that. Whatever lights a leather couch on fire, it's got to have a lot of power to it.
So how could the couch have caught fire?
We talked to some of the people again that were associated with the fire, including Kelly O'Neill, and found out the other types of things that were in the room. One of the things that we found out was that there were several bean bags that were in the room. And we know that the bean bags, they're filled full of styrofoam beads, and styrofoam burns pretty good.
However, according to what Kelly told them, the bean bags hadn't been anywhere near the couch.
They were about 10 or 12 feet away, and they were all stacked up together on the foosball table.
At least that's where they were supposed to have been.
We found the metal remains for the foosball table, but we didn't find any of the remains of the bean bags.
But when they took a closer look at the remains of the couch, the fire investigators noticed something clinging to the coiled springs of the cushions.
We found some melted blobs of stuff that we thought was probably the remnants of foam. So the hypothesis that we got was, that we came up with was, well, what if somebody put one of those bean bags over there and lit it on fire?
And they even tested their theory.
We got a description of the bean bags from Kelly O'Neill. She told us the type. We went to Walmart, got a similar kind, and tested it to see whether it could be easily ignited with just a regular lighter. We used a barbecue lighter to light that on fire, and it was completely consumed in a very few short minutes.
and the fact that someone had apparently moved the beanbags to the couch in order to better fuel the blaze led fire investigators to an inescapable conclusion.
At that point, the fire marshal indicates that it's intentional fire and arson.
And since Darcy Jr. died as a result of the arson, the fire marshal handed the investigation off to the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office.
We step in and we treat it like it's a homicide.
The investigators didn't have to look too far to find a suspect either. In fact, all they had to do was pull Shelley's police record.
Shelley Arndt had been involved in 2 other fires.
In November of 2011, there were 2 separate fires, about 24 hours apart, set at her residence.
Both fires occurred at the home Shelley and Darcy shared with his father, and the first, on November 7th, 2011, hadn't initially been reported to law enforcement.
It was a small fire that happened inside her house. It was early morning hours. The fire department came there, they put it out, and it was deemed to be accidental.
But then a second fire had occurred the following day.
The next day, the same fire investigators who went out the day before thought that was just more than just coincidence, and they also asked for the Bremerton Police Department to respond as well. During that investigation, eventually Shelley admitted to being angry with Darcy and setting that second fire.
The confession had earned Shelley an arson conviction and a 9-month jail sentence. But if the fact that she'd done time for arson wasn't suspicious enough, when the fire investigators read the report on Shelley's confession, the details sounded awfully familiar.
She went down to the basement and put some cloth, some towels, or other type of materials on an upholstered chair and set that on fire.
In other words, it was almost identical to the fire marshal's theory about the origins of the blaze that destroyed her sister's house.
Oftentimes, people who set fire tend to set them in the same way that they have before.
Could Shelley have set her sister's house on fire using the same technique she'd tried 3 years earlier? And was she really capable of harming Darcy? As the investigators discovered, the arson charge wasn't the only conviction on Shelley's record.
There was a prior conviction for 4th-degree assault, domestic violence.
The charge stemmed from an even earlier incident. The assault occurred in 2008, and unlike the arson attempts, this time Shelley had tried a more direct approach.
She grabbed a big kitchen knife and lunged at him with the knife, and the tip of the knife went through the clothing and hit his chest, but it didn't actually penetrate his skin.
It hadn't penetrated, in part, because Shelley had been drunk when she picked up the knife.
They were involved in a lot of alcohol abuse. They were both alcoholics.
And their drinking had led to a lot of turmoil throughout their 14 years together.
I think Darcy and Shelley's difficulties started the day, honestly, that they met. You put 2 alcoholics together, it would sometimes get pretty ugly.
The Bremerton Police Department had quite a bit of contact with them. Typically, Shelley Arndt was the one who was making the calls, claiming domestic violence, but oftentimes she was the aggressor.
When she would get going with drinking, she would get mean. That's how she was when she drank.
But on the night of the fire, had Shelley been drunk enough and angry enough to set the blaze that killed her boyfriend and left her sister's family homeless? Questioned by the sheriff's investigators, Shelley's sister said that as far as she knew, Shelley and Darcy had been having a fairly good night.
They were not fighting, they were not arguing, everybody was getting along, but then I went to bed by midnight. I don't know what happened after that.
But according to Shelley's nephew, things had taken a combative turn shortly after his mother went to bed.
I actually woke up around midnight, 12:30. I had to use the restroom, so I walked out and I vaguely heard arguing out from the other room, and it sounded like Darcy and Shelley. From what I had heard, his paycheck's been short, and she was wondering where it went, and he didn't have a definitive answer. He was saying that his hours were shorter, which they honestly probably were. And she proceeded to get really angry at him.
At the time, Spencer had shrugged off the incident and headed back to his room.
I didn't think it was going to lead up to anything. I thought they were just going to work it over like they always did.
A drunken argument, a tumultuous relationship, and a history of arson. To the investigators, it all pointed to Shelley.
3 fires in 3 years is more than just coincidence.
Lightning doesn't strike twice. It struck 3 times.
Convinced that the fatal fire had striking similarities to her earlier arsons, the investigators decided it was time to talk to her again.
My partner and I responded to Shelley's residence to get a little bit more information, and we spoke to her on the front porch. She was just a little standoffish with us. She kept her arms crossed in front of her chest most of the time we were talking to her, but she denied being involved in the fire at all.
Although she did see how the investigators could suspect she was involved.
She told us about her tumultuous relationship with him, that at times he could be mean and there was some domestic violence between the two of them. But she said that she loved him.
And when the investigators asked Shelley to take a voice stress test, she readily agreed.
A voice stress test is it's another tool, an investigative tool like a polygraph. They can actually analyze how your voice changes if you're lying.
But would Shelley's confidence in taking the test be borne out by the results?
They gave her a voice stress test, and she flunked it.
And when the investigators told Shelley she'd failed the test, her denials about the fire suddenly changed.
She, at that point, told me that she believed she blacked out several times that night, and that there's parts of the morning of the fire that she does not remember. We kind of went with that, and we let her explain that more and more and more. It got to a point where she said that she could have gotten up, that she could have started the fire.
It was as close as the investigators would get to a confession, because on March 28th, when they finally placed Shelley under arrest for Darcy's murder, her responses had once again turned to denials.
When they arrested her, she's kept telling them, I didn't do it, I didn't do it.
Not that the police believed her. In fact, neither did her sister.
I believe that the day that she came over, that she had it in her mind that day that she was going to set this fire. And that's my honest belief.
Coming up, the prosecutors make the case for murder.
They suggested that that was actually part of her plan to get him drunk, so drunk he couldn't save himself when she started the fire.
But could they prove Shelley lit the fatal blaze?
If you are going to say that this is an arson fire, you have to say, I have eliminated every other possible accidental cause.
On October 12, 2015, Shelley Arndt went on trial for murder at the Kitsap County Superior Court in Port Orchard, Washington. The 46-year-old was accused of intentionally setting the fatal blaze that killed her boyfriend, 37-year-old Darcy Veter Jr.
When Shelley Arndt was originally arrested, she was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree arson.
It took a long time to come to trial, but it was an aggravated murder case by then.
And if convicted, Shelley faced some potentially serious consequences.
In Washington State, aggravated murder can carry the death penalty, but it also carries life in prison.
Shelley had told investigators that she didn't remember setting the fire, but the prosecution disagreed. In their opening, they suggested that lighting the fire was just the last step in what was actually a devious plot to ensure that Darcy Jr. died in the blaze.
There was allegations that she was well aware of how much Darcy Veter had consumed, how much alcohol he had consumed, and how difficult it would have been to wake him up.
The prosecution suggested to the jury that not only did Shelley premeditate this killing, she actually helped get Darcy very drunk. Throughout the course of the day, she got him drunker and drunker.
Going so far as to make a late-night run to the store to get more beer for her already well-intoxicated boyfriend, according to the prosecution.
They suggested that that was actually part of her plan to get him drunk, so drunk he couldn't save himself when she started the fire.
The argument from the state was that she wanted out of the relationship by killing Darcy Veter Jr.
But why kill him?
She didn't really have a big beef with him. It's not like he was having an affair, or he was beating her, or, he was doing terrible things.
According to the prosecution, Shelley's motive for killing Darcy started with the fact that as a serious alcoholic, she couldn't support herself alone.
She didn't really have any ambitions to work. She could never maintain a job.
Instead, it was Darcy, who was at least a functional alcoholic, who provided most of the couple's income.
He didn't miss work. He, did his job.
And that might have argued against even leaving Darcy, unless there was a way to be rid of him and have enough money to live on.
She had this inclination that, she had this life insurance policy coming if he died.
And according to the testimony of Detective Lisa Gundrum with the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office, Shelley had tried to collect, too.
We went back and we spoke with Darcy's employer, some of his coworkers, and some of the things they had told me that happened shortly after the fire. The fire was on a Sunday, and on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, Shelley went into Darcy's work to notify them of his death, turn in his badges, and then she was inquiring about his life insurance and his retirement policies.
But was Shelley's sudden interest in Darcy's insurance and retirement really a motive for murder? Or was it simply the natural reaction of a woman struggling to deal with her boyfriend's sudden death?
She was indicating that she also wanted to make funeral arrangements right away. So his work gave her some local funeral homes to contact.
However, as far as insurance and Darcy's 401k went, there was nothing they could do to help her.
She was not the beneficiary. The beneficiary was his father.
But if that was true, wouldn't a lack of financial motive undercut the prosecution's case? That was certainly the defense's position. They argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Shelley was wrongly accused of a crime she didn't commit.
A big theme in the defense case was that the fire investigators, the government investigators, based on Shelley's priors, they had already concluded that it was an arson and that she had done it, and then they selectively looked for information that would support that approach.
The investigators didn't really investigate anybody else to see if they set the fire.
Although the defense didn't put Shelley on the stand to plead her innocence.
She actually spent most of the trial just writing on a notepad.
She sat in the courtroom for the whole trial, never showed an emotion.
Instead, the defense spent much of its time questioning whether a crime had been committed at all.
At the heart of the defense's argument at trial was that law enforcement had not fully investigated alternative theories on how the fire started.
The defense put on more of a technical, expert witness-based case. He hired his own expert and just battled the whole prosecution arson case by saying, if you are going to say that this is an arson fire, then in the world of fire investigation protocol and procedures, you have to say, I have eliminated every other possible accidental cause of this fire.
The defense argument was that investigators had not followed proper procedure in investigating the fire.
There was also an argument on the defense part that all the experts that followed, they really relied heavily on what the fire marshal did, on the fire marshal's photos, on the fire marshal's cataloging of the evidence, and they argued it wasn't sufficiently thorough.
Especially once they discovered that Shelley had a prior arson conviction.
The defense argued that they only keyed in on Shelley Arndt.
But would it be enough to sway the jury? In closings, the prosecution did its best to turn the focus away from any problems in their case and put it back on Shelley.
The prosecution, acknowledged its burden to prove things beyond a reasonable doubt and said that they had met the burden. This was an arson, that this wasn't a case that the government created against her. This was a case that she created by what she did.
Coming up, will the jurors believe that she'd been wrongly accused?
It's hard to get juries to think badly of the government investigator.
Or will they decide that Shelley intended to kill Darcy, no matter what it cost?
That's hard to wrap my head around, how someone that you love could take that risk with your life and the life of your family.
On November 23, 2015, the jury announced a verdict in the trial of Shelley Arndt. The 46-year-old was charged with aggravated murder and arson, accused of intentionally setting the fire that endangered the lives of her sister's entire family and killed Shelley's boyfriend, Darcy Veeder Jr.
The prosecution told the jury she wanted this man out of her life. She tried before, and in her view, this was the way she could get him out.
The defense, on the other hand, argued that Shelley's prior arson conviction had tainted the entire investigation.
The defense was basically attacking everything about the prosecution, saying they didn't look at other suspects, they did a rush to judgment to her as the only suspect.
So which side would the jury believe?
The jury found Shelley Arndt guilty on all counts.
It's hard to get juries to think badly of the government investigator.
Especially when they had plenty of reason to think badly of Shelley.
The jurors really paid attention to her history, where she had assaulted him with a knife. I mean, there had been a lot, so I think that they took the totality of everything, making their decision.
Much like the trial, Shelley didn't appear all that fazed by the jury's decision.
She was generally pretty stoic, didn't react to much of anything.
And the same was true of her sentencing hearing on December 21st.
At the sentencing, she had every right and every chance to speak for herself and also to apologize to everybody that she victimized. And she chose not to at all.
I was stunned. I was completely mortified that let alone any person but your own twin sister could take everything that you've ever had in your entire life and it's gone in one night. And she never showed remorse. She's never apologized to me for it.
But was that because she had nothing to say?
She didn't care about Junior or the house or the dog or anything like that, or even the emotional impact on us.
Or because there was nothing Shelley could say?
I know that before, when she's drank, she's had lapses in memory. And I think that she drank so much that she has no memory of actually committing the crime, which would be hard for someone to stand up and say they have remorse for if they have no memory of it.
Either way, it had little bearing on the judge's decision.
She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
It's an outcome that Shelley's family still struggles with.
It would have been easier if it had been a stranger, because that's hard to wrap my head around, is how someone that you love, who you've known since you were born, could take that risk with your life and the life of your family.
But in the end, even Shelley's twin sister believes that prison is where she belongs.
Do I feel sorry for her? Hell no, I don't feel sorry for her at all. If you start a fire, you take somebody's life, then then that is what happens to you. You're gonna go to jail.
Shujia Ayobi came to America seeking a new life.
She grew up in a fairly conservative community in Afghanistan. In the United States, she had choices.
America was also where she met and married Ghulam, a fellow refugee serving his adopted country.
His primary duty was to train the American soldiers to Afghan culture.
You could see that my uncle was truly in love with Shujia.
Together, they had 4 children.
They had a beautiful life, happy life.
But their happiness would be cut short by a deadly carjacking.
Somebody shot my husband!
People in the community were scared. It made the news.
The search for the killers would leave the investigators wondering, was the shooting simply a random crime?
Somebody wanted money.
Was it a matter of national security?
We had a surprise visit from the FBI.
Is this some act of terrorism?
Or was there a terrible secret lurking inside Shajia's marriage?
Suicide left in my country, you would be killed. You would be hung, beheaded, you'd be killed. Here I went to the police. Police won't do anything.
Sacramento, California, December 18th, 2011. An hour and a half northeast of San Francisco, California's capital is a quiet, comfortable city of almost 500,000.
Very lovely community, green, lush, affordable. It's just all around a good all-American city.
It has a nice hometown charm to it that not a lot of other cities in California have.
But Sacramento's hometown charms would be shattered a little after midnight when the police received a hysterical 911 call from 45-year-old Shajia Ayobi.
Somebody shot my husband!
Shajia Ayobi reported that she had been a victim of carjacking and her husband, who was in the car at the time, had been shot.
Shajia said they were driving home when the two carjackers attacked.
Two perpetrators pop up, one's got a gun, they order her to pull over.
These two people in the back seat demanded her husband's wallet. When he refused or struggled, they shot him.
While you were on the freeway? On the freeway, and they got off!
After shooting her husband, the carjackers had apparently panicked, and they ran.
According to Miss Ayobi, the assailants flee the car on foot.
She was able to continue driving and get her phone out and call 911.
Are you still driving? Take a deep breath and pull over to the right shoulder. What exit are you there?
Shajia took the exit, and officers arrived on the scene moments later.
We're trying to get descriptions and more information, but the female happens very hysterical right now.
Shajia's hysteria was understandable, because when the police arrived, they found her husband, 53-year-old Ghulam Ayobi, sprawled in the passenger seat of the couple's minivan, covered in blood.
Ghulam was shot 3 times in the head.
However, while Ghulam's condition was dire, he wasn't dead.
Mr. Ayobi still had some signs of life, so he was transported to the hospital.
And even as the doctors raced to save him, the search for Ghulam's shooters would send the investigators deep into a world of international intrigue, attract the attention of national security agencies, and have the authorities wondering, was there more to the shooting than a simple carjacking? Born in 1966, Shajia was just 13 years old when the Soviet Union invaded her homeland of Afghanistan.
She was from a war-torn country as a young girl. She witnessed atrocities
and the trauma of seeing different people in her family be murdered.
To escape the violence, Shajia's family arranged for the 17-year-old to immigrate to California in 1984. They also arranged for the teenager to marry an Afghan man already living in the States.
So a lot of choice was taken away from this woman. Most of her decisions were made for her,
which didn't necessarily sit well with Shajia.
She's very independent, and she didn't not want to be attached to anyone or rely on anyone or have to answer to anyone. She wanted to do what she wished to do.
However, Shajia didn't dare defy her family.
They had a very close, tight-knit family, and they were very traditional in some ways.
And once married and settled in California, Shajia did fall in love with her new home.
And she wanted to be American.
And she embraced her new home by doing something that would have been unthinkable back in Afghanistan. Shajia ended her arranged marriage by filing for divorce.
In the United States, she had choices.
Free from her arranged marriage, Shajia blossomed in America. She got a job to support herself and even took some college courses.
She was such a strong personality, and she was a go-getter.
She didn't turn her back on her homeland, though. Instead, she got to know other members of the Bay Area's close-knit Afghan community.
My mom was really good close friends with her.
She became really good friends with my sister and I.
And it was through those new connections in the Afghan community that Shajia would meet a fellow refugee named Ghulam Ayobi. 8 years older than Shajia, Ghulam was in his early 20s when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
He'd finished high school and college there.
After the invasion, he ended up on the front lines as a rebel fighting the Soviets and as a soldier in the civil war that followed their pullout in 1989. But as the Taliban's grip tightened, Ghulam eventually fled.
He left because our situation was not safe in Afghanistan.
Emigrating to Germany, Ghulam spent the next several years helping the rest of his extended family escape Afghanistan.
He would work single-handedly, of course, and send money to us.
With Ghulam's help, his sister and her children settled in California, where she got to know Shajia.
My mom thought that she would be a good match with my uncle.
And in 1993, when Ghulam came to the States to visit his sister, she arranged a meeting.
My mom kind of introduced them, hoping that those two could, meet up and get married.
And based on Ghulam's reaction, it looked like that introduction just might work as his sister planned.
He would just rave about Shajia, how beautiful she is and how much he loves her.
Shajia seemed just as head over heels, too.
Looked like it was a match made in heaven.
I thought they were the happiest couple.
Before Ghulam went back to Germany, they were formally engaged.
They had actually what we call it nikah. It's a religious ceremony that we had to do before the men and women get together.
And a few months later, Shajia followed her fiancé abroad.
They got married in Germany.
The couple spent the next 12 years in Germany and had 4 children together.
Ghulam was very traditional, so that caused her to kind of be the stay-home mom.
He wanted Shajia to be really committed to the children, making sure that they were happy.
Meanwhile, Ghulam focused on providing for the family.
My uncle was working. They had a really, really great life in Germany, but Shajia always wanted to come back to US.
And in 2005, Shajia got her wish. After more than a decade of marriage, the family moved back to the States and eventually settled in the San Francisco area.
They lived in the East Bay for a while, closer to my mom.
Living in East Bay, Shajia continued to stay home with the kids, while Ghulam worked long hours to support the family.
He ran a succession of businesses. He ran a hot dog cart. They had a pizza parlor business in the Bay Area.
But then a military contractor approached Ghulam and offered the former soldier a job as a cultural advisor for the U.S. Army.
They recruited him to train the American soldiers, get them prepared for, being deployed into Afghanistan and serving there.
Ghulam took the job out of duty to his family.
My uncle tried to do whatever he could to provide for the family.
And out of pride in his newly adopted home.
He was a person who respected what this country had to offer.
However, Ghulam's new job did require a sacrifice.
He was stationed in Louisiana, but I know he traveled outside of Louisiana to train soldiers.
He would only come every 2 to 3 months for a week at home.
The money was good, though. In fact, Ghulam's generous salary allowed the family to move out of a cramped apartment in the Bay Area and into a nice house in Sacramento.
My uncle always wanted to have a big house for the kids and always wanted them to live in a better community and go to a better school.
With her husband often away and the kids getting older, Shajia kept herself busy too. Thanks to her husband's connections, she did some translating work for the government.
Shajia spoke several different languages.
And after almost 2 decades of focusing on her family, the 45-year-old also went back to school, taking criminal justice classes at the local community college.
She always wanted to be independent.
She also visited her homeland for the first time since she'd fled more than 20 years earlier.
She would travel to Afghanistan once or twice a year.
She made a lot of trips by herself.
Foreign vacations, a comfortable suburban home, and a bright future. By 2011, it looked like Shajia and Ghulam had put their war-torn past well behind them.
They came here to achieve the things that they could not in Afghanistan.
This family did live an American dream.
But that December, more than 2 decades after escaping Afghanistan, Shajia and Ghulam would discover that no place is safe from sudden and seemingly senseless violence. Coming up, is the attack on Ghulam simply a robbery gone wrong?
Carjackings are a very real fear in California.
Or is it a matter of national security?
We had a surprise visit from the FBI.
2011, 45-year-old Shajia Iobi called 911 in Sacramento, California, and reported that she and her husband, 53-year-old Ghulam Iobi, had been the victims of a violent carjacking while driving down the freeway.
They shot my husband, but I was still inside the car. They got out.
She was directed to pull off the freeway, and the patrol officers met Mrs. Iobi.
Shajia was completely unharmed, but Ghulam is in very critical condition.
He'd been shot 3 times in the head.
Paramedics weren't sure that he was going to make it.
While the paramedics loaded Ghulam into an ambulance and rushed him to the nearest hospital, the investigators drove Shajia to the police station to take her statement.
I hope you can finish as soon as possible with the hospital.
Yeah, we're going to do our best.
Shajia began the interview by explaining that her husband was an Afghan refugee who worked as a cultural specialist for the U.S. Army.
The soldier before they deployed to Afghanistan, he gives her some kind of training role play. So it's called like linguist/role play.
His primary duty was to train and familiarize the American soldiers to Afghan culture.
Normally stationed in Louisiana, Shajia said that her husband had flown home on a red-eye the night before.
So he'd barely been home 24 hours then.
He arrived in Sacramento very early in the morning, and he hadn't seen his kids for 6 months, so he stayed up all day.
And that night, they'd gone to a dinner party hosted by friends.
So just the two of us, we went and the kids stayed home with my mom.
Shajia said that the party had ended just before midnight, and Ghulam, going on more than 24 hours without sleep, had asked her to drive home.
I started driving until I got close to the freeway. And then I heard another voice from the back. I didn't see him at all, or maybe they were all the way in the back and I couldn't see at all. They just came out all of a sudden. I just heard the noise of the voice first.
The carjacker emerged from the back of the minivan, and he announced that he was robbing them.
I tried to see if I could talk him out of it, like what he wants. So I said, what do you want? I know you want money, whatever. We can give it to you. Can you please don't do something, He said, yeah, I told my husband, give me your wallet.
Shajia said that she had told Ghulam to hand over his wallet, but Ghulam had refused.
He tried to grab him, I think. He tried to resist something.
Your husband tried to grab the guy?
And according to Shajia, that's when she heard the first shot.
I think they shot him one more time. It's like... I'm still so shocked.
And according to Shajia, she wasn't the only one shocked by the shooting.
As soon as he fired, and I heard another voice, and it was a female voice.
There were 2 assailants in the back of her minivan.
It was a male-female robbery team.
She got mad at him, just called them or something, said, why did you do? We just want the money.
Shajia said the carjackers had argued briefly in the back seat and then fled with Ghulam's wallet.
He said, baby, quick, stop right here. We're gonna get off. Or something, don't look, or something, just keep going, he said. So as soon as I just stopped, they jumped, closed the door, and then I took off.
According to Shajia, while the carjackers had left her unhurt, she said that it had all happened so fast, there was little she could tell the police about the attackers.
If somebody got out of the car, you might have seen somebody moving around outside. Did you see anybody moving around outside?
Yeah, they told me that they were gonna get out, right? So as soon as they got out, they shut the door so hard. And I got back, I didn't see because it's so dark, the windows are tinted and they were hard outside, they closed the door so fast.
And she wasn't sure how they'd gotten in her back seat either.
The carjackers must have gotten in their van while they were parked at a friend's house for a dinner.
Where was your car parked at the house?
Around the corner, like a door in front of it.
It was a harrowing story, and it was about to get worse.
I'm really sorry to have to tell you that your husband didn't survive. I want to let you know we're going to do everything we can to solve this.
You're kidding me.
I'm very, very sorry.
that morning, the rest of Ghulam's family was just as devastated.
The first question was, is it true that my uncle has been killed, murdered? Reality hit me. I collapsed. I lay down on the floor crying.
My first reaction was like, it's impossible. This is not true.
But when the deadly carjacking made the news, it seemed all too plausible and frightening to the rest of Sacramento.
Carjackings are a very real fear in California.
There are a number of gangs there as well that kind of migrate from the Bay Area and from the Stockton area as well.
And when crime scene technicians finished processing the family's impounded minivan, what they found also appeared to fit the carjacking scenario Shajia described.
The shooting happened inside the van. We have no doubt about that from the trajectories involved and the shell casings.
But could they ever track down the shooters? Later that same morning, just hours after the shooting, the investigators got what appeared to be their first big break.
There's an apartment complex where a maintenance worker doing his normal rounds saw this brand new looking laptop bag right on top of the pile of trash. And when he opened it up, he found a wallet that turned out to have Mr. Ayobi's identification in it, and it was covered in blood.
A .32 caliber pistol was also in the bag.
That matched the shell casings that we found in the car.
And yet, while they had apparently recovered the murder weapon, there were still some aspects of the crime that puzzled the investigators.
It's very odd for people to be driving down the freeway and be carjacked in that manner.
Usually carjackings happen at intersections. They're approached at gunpoint, told to get out of the car, put the vehicle in park, and to exit the vehicle. And that's kind of how carjackings happen.
There's going to be something more to this case.
It was a theory the investigators would explore further a few days later when they received an unexpected visitor.
We had a surprise visit from the FBI.
Normally, the Bureau wouldn't get involved in something like a carjacking, even a suspicious one like Ghulam's death. But the Afghan refugee wasn't a typical murder victim.
He was a military contractor training our troops getting ready to deploy to Afghanistan.
Could the murder have something to do with Ghulam's job?
Is this some act of terrorism?
The possibility was there. So that actually caused us a lot of concern.
But was that also why the FBI had taken a sudden interest in the case? The answer was not exactly.
This agent was a handler for Shajia.
And why would Shajia have an FBI handler? It turned out that while her husband worked for the military, training troops as a cultural advisor, Shajia had also been working for the government as what was euphemistically known as a cultural informant.
The FBI counterintelligence has a program where people who are traveling abroad are recruited to, when they return to the United States, to give a report on basically what people are thinking, what their mindset is, and how they feel about America.
Which was a roundabout way of saying that Shajia was dabbling in espionage. Coming up, Shajia takes the international intrigue to the next level.
She said it was a CIA plot.
And according to Shajia, Ghulam was the target.
It's leaking a lot of information.
By New Year's 2012, it had been 2 weeks since Shajia Ayobi's husband Ghulam had been gunned down in what she said was a deadly carjacking.
People in the community were scared. It made the news.
But the investigators were starting to have doubts.
The story about how a carjacker was concealed inside the car and made himself known while they were in motion, to me that sounded very Hollywood.
But the most Hollywood aspect of the story had to be what the investigators learned about Shajia, that the 45-year-old Afghan immigrant and mother of 4 was actually a government informant working for the FBI.
They apparently have a network of people that do that, travel to Afghanistan.
Couple that with the fact that Ghulam worked for the U.S. military as a cultural advisor, and the investigators wondered if the so-called carjacking was simply a cover for something else.
Knowing that both Mr. Ayobi and Miss Ayobi had worked for the United States government at some point, it might very well have made them a target for some terrorist type of organization.
However, there was one big problem with the idea that Shajia's spying had something to do with her husband's murder.
Sajia was completely unharmed, even as her husband was critically wounded and later died.
Something's just not right with the story.
So doubtful that terrorists had anything to do with Ghulam's murder, and hoping they might have some insight into who else might want him dead, the investigators turned to his family. Questioned about Shajia and Ghulam's marriage, the family told the investigators that the couple had seemed happy.
You could see that my uncle was truly in love with Shajia.
She was very pleasant, very outgoing, a very fun person to be around with.
But the family said that Shajia had changed after moving to Sacramento, that she joined a new mosque and turned her back on her earlier American lifestyle.
She started following a lot of Islamic rules, started wearing, of course, the burqas.
And if the sudden change in Shajia wasn't unsettling enough for Ghulam, the family said she'd forced the children into following her example too.
His children had simply converted and changed 100%, 360 degree from a modern living style, open-minded, and just like any child in the United States, individuals wearing burqas.
According to the family, Shajia and Ghulam regularly fought over the issue.
My uncle wanted them to be raised as an Afghan American, to know their culture, but at the same time, when we live here, we have to adapt American lifestyle. She did not want to hear what my uncle has to say about the kids or her, or their lifestyle or the way Shajia was raising the kids.
Informed of the trouble in Shajia and Ghulam's marriage, the investigators brought Shajia in for more questioning on January 19th.
We've been working very hard to try to solve this case. The forensic evidence that we have is very, very good, but it requires somebody to put it in perspective, and that's what I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell us.
But what Shajia had to tell them wasn't at all what they expected. Instead of talking about her marriage or the alleged attackers, the former FBI informant was about to add a whole new level of intrigue to the case.
Over a year ago, somebody came to my door and wanted to visit me in the morning. It was sometime in November of last year, 2010, year before. He showed me his ID badge, CIA agent, said that he's a special operation or task force or something.
And according to Shajia, the CIA agent had come to talk about her husband.
He'd explained to her that they had been watching Ghulam for a while.
He's leaking a lot of information to outsiders.
Miss Iobi's second story was that he had become this sort of double agent.
Shajia said that she had been shocked by the news.
I got so scared, and he said that they know a lot about him.
And according to Shajia, the CIA was prepared to put a stop to Ghulam's spying too.
I said you can just fire him, if he's not a good person for the job. He said, no, we can do that, but that's not enough. We have to get rid of him.
She said it was a CIA plot to kill her husband.
Although according to Shajia, the agent asked her to take Ghulam out for them.
They just handed me a bag, said that, okay, save this for right now, and we will notify you next time what to do about it. I just took it, and I said, let me open it. He opened it, and inside it was a gun.
Shajia said that she'd held on to the gun for several months until the CIA agent contacted her again.
He showed up again at the door one day, and then he said that I didn't do anything. I said, I don't know what to do. I can't do. I don't know how to shoot. I don't have the guts to shoot. How am I going to do this? He said, okay, we will help you with this.
And according to Shajia, that's when the CIA agent told her to hide the gun in her minivan.
Put it under the seat in the back.
investigators could do to keep a straight face.
I knew that it was preposterous. I was skeptical about it the whole time.
For starters, how many secrets could a mere cultural advisor pass on to the enemy?
He wasn't that high ranking. I don't even know what type of clearances he had.
And even if the CIA had wanted to stop Ghulam, wouldn't they have done it in secret rather than involve Shajia?
It's just totally unbelievable.
And the investigators let Shajia know it, too.
Shajia, your story does not make sense.
To me, it makes sense.
It doesn't make sense. At that point, she was arrested.
The fact that Shajia had been charged with Ghulam's murder didn't exactly take his family by surprise.
Hard as it is, deep down, I knew Shajia had something to do with it, all along.
But was Shajia actually the person who pulled the trigger? Because the next day, after her mugshot and the story of her arrest made the papers, a staff member from the college where Shajia had taken criminal justice classes walked into the Sacramento Police Department with some urgent information.
He said, I need to tell you some details about this story.
The man told the investigators Shajia had been close to one of her classmates, 19-year-old Jake Clark.
Jake Clark is a very personable, very likable person. He's got a very outgoing personality.
And according to the school staff member, Jake had approached him a few weeks before Ghulam's murder to ask his advice about something.
Shajia was soliciting him to buy a gun.
He said that at the time, he'd essentially blown Jake off.
He didn't take him seriously until he saw Shajia's photo in the paper, and he thought, there's a connection here.
Did Jake have inside information about Ghulam's murder? After receiving the tip, the investigators brought the young man in for questioning.
He was very cooperative, acted like he wanted to help.
And he told the investigators that part of the way through the fall semester, Shajia had pulled him aside and made a shocking request.
She was like, look, I have this problem. My friend's husband has been abusing their daughter and has been abusing and raping the daughter and abusing the wife. In my country, he would be killed. He would be hung, beheaded, and be killed. Here I went to the police. Police won't do anything. I want him taken care of.
According to Jake, she'd been willing to pay.
She was like, Jake, I really need you to do this. I will pay you. For $10,000, I will pay you.
Jake said he'd refuse Shajia's offer.
And that doesn't settle well with me.
But when the investigators checked Shajia's bank records, they told a very different story.
We found two $5,000 transactions, one month before the murder and one a couple of days before the murder.
And when the investigators pulled Shajia's cell phone records, they found evidence suggesting that the money had gone to Jake.
The day before the murder, Jake texted his address to her to go meet her. We knew at that point there's something up. Jake is more intertwined and involved in this case than met the eye.
But could they prove it? The key turned out to be the messenger bag that the police had found dumped in the trash at an apartment complex near the murder scene. A bag that had contained a gun, Ghulam's bloody wallet, and as it turned out, something else.
That bag also contained the DNA of Jake Clark.
Armed with new evidence, the investigators took Jake into custody. But when the investigators confronted him, Jake maintained that he was innocent.
I did not sit in the backseat of that car and shoot that man.
But if that was true, how had his DNA ended up on the bag with the gun? According to Jake, it all started with a phone call he received just minutes before Shajia dialed 911 to report the carjacking.
Answer it. Somebody breathing hard. It was Shaw. Okay, so I know you're tripping now. Something's gone down.
Jake said that Shajia, obviously in a panic, asked him to meet her at a street corner not far from his old apartment.
His story is that she pulled up in the minivan, and he said he saw Mr. Ayobi was mortally wounded on the front seat.
She pulled up. Boom. I see him. He slumps. She pushes him back. I need you to take this.
She gave him $100 and the bag containing the gun.
I take that, walk to the apartments, throw the bag right where you found it. Because otherwise, if I was like, where did we find it? In the trash can in the apartment complex.
He said the reason why he did that was to help her get caught.
That was my thinking behind it. Now I see him in the front seat, dead. I seen the murder weapon. Now you guys have the murder weapon.
And according to Jake, that made him a hero.
Said you guys give medals to people for that, correct?
In his mind, he thinks that we never would have solved it if we didn't find the bag with the evidence.
Coming up, the investigators uncover a powerful motive.
So altogether, it could have equated to $700,000, maybe $1 million.
And Shajia offers up yet another explanation.
Everything becomes about paranoia and imminent danger.
On April 15, 2013, Shajia Ayobi went on trial for murder in Sacramento, California. The 46-year-old Afghan refugee and mother of 4 was accused of masterminding the murder of her husband Ghulam, a cultural advisor for the U.S. military.
Initially, the reports were that this was a carjacking, and a carjacking that had gone terribly badly.
And when the investigators began to doubt Shajia's carjacking story, she'd made an even more incredible claim.
Shajia said that she was involved in assisting the CIA to murder Ghulam as basically a double agent.
But in their opening argument, the prosecution claimed that Ghulam's murder had nothing to do with government spies, terrorism, or the war in Afghanistan.
She was dissatisfied with the way her life was going.
And most of all, according to the prosecution, she was dissatisfied with her marriage.
She was happier when her husband wasn't around.
Years ago, Shajia had divorced her first husband, but that was before she had any children.
She couldn't leave him, just walk out of the marriage because of the children.
And it was also before she joined a new, much more conservative mosque.
In our culture and religion, divorce is very bad. Women are not looked good upon if they are divorced.
The prosecution believed that that stigma of getting divorced a second time would be too much for her to bear.
However, avoiding the stigma of divorce may not have been Shajia's only motive. According to the prosecutors, Ghulam's murder may have been about money, too.
But there was a $285,000 insurance policy out for Ghulam.
And that wasn't all that Shajia stood to inherit either. There were also Ghulam's retirement accounts and the family's comfortable suburban home.
So altogether, it could have equated to $700,000, maybe $1 million.
She stood to gain a lot, both emotionally by being able to live her life the way she demanded to, but also to be able to afford to do so.
And according to the prosecutors, that was why Shajia had approached her classmate, 19-year-old Jake Clark, in the fall of 2011 and offered him $10,000 in exchange for killing Ghulam.
This was premeditated. Shajia had planned. She knew exactly what she wanted to do.
And the prosecutors claimed that on the evening of December 17th, when she and Ghulam went to dinner at a friend's house, Shajia put her plan into motion.
I think that Shajia left the van open and told Jake where the van was, and he got into it and waited.
Ghulam, exhausted after his red-eye flight the night before, didn't suspect a thing.
He wants Shajia to drive, reclines the seat back to make it more comfortable for the 20 or 30-minute ride home.
And according to the prosecutors, not long after Shajia drove off with her husband dozing in the passenger seat, Jake had made his move.
I think it was an execution. I don't think he had time to resist.
Then, with her husband dying beside her, the prosecutors theorized that Shajia had driven Jake to the apartment complex.
When she dropped him off, he immediately deposited the evidence into the dumpster.
And whether Jake intended the murder weapon to be found or not, the texts between Shajia and Jake, and the $10,000 she withdrew from her bank account shortly before the shooting all pointed to Shajia being behind the murder.
The two $5,000 transactions right before the murder are very significant.
But would it be enough to convince the jury? Despite admitting to hiding the murder weapon, Jake had never agreed to testify against Shajia.
I think he enjoyed the cat and mouse game that he played with us during the investigation.
But they did have Shajia's earlier statement, where she had claimed to be part of a CIA plot to kill her husband.
She conceded to having had some involvement in the homicide. That's not disputed.
So, trapped by Shajia's earlier statements, when it was the defense's turn, they offered a new twist. According to Shajia, what she'd allegedly told Jake about wanting to take out an abusive husband was true, only it wasn't for a friend.
Her story totally changed to say that she suffered years of abuse at the hands of Ghulam Ayobi.
Shajia's defense was that she suffered PTSD.
Not just from her husband's alleged abuse, either. When Shajia took the stand in her own defense, she claimed that she had been battered by life.
She had PTSD from growing up in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion.
And according to Shajia, that was on top of the trauma she suffered as Ghulam's wife.
He was described as a very domineering figure in the household.
He was allegedly very abusive, both physically and emotionally.
And she testified that her only relief had come when Ghulam's new job took him to Louisiana for months at a time.
For 2 to 3 years, my uncle was in another state. He wasn't living with her. He was barely at the house.
Although according to Shajia, the abuse continued whenever he did return, so much so that she dreaded every homecoming.
The defense argues that everything becomes about paranoia.
And by December of 2011, Shajia said she had reached her breaking point.
Over a long period of time of her having been abused by this man, she finally snapped.
To her, there were no options left to her.
That's what Shajia claimed, at least.
The defense was that she should be acquitted because it was an act of self-defense.
The prosecution and Ghulam's family strenuously objected to Shajia's portrayal of her husband.
There was no evidence that he was abusive.
The Ghulam that we knew, and she knew just as well, was not capable of hurting even a fly.
But they also worried that Shajia's story of abuse might play into the jury's preconceptions.
The story can be really heartbreaking because women are a lot more oppressed in conservative Islamic society.
And Ghulam's family figured that Shajia was playing to that prejudice when she accused him of abuse in the first place.
She's a very intelligent lady. She was very convincing. We were definitely worried that she may get away with this.
Coming up, the jury struggles to reach a verdict.
They were having a really hard time coming to a unanimous decision.
On April 25th, 2013, the jury retired to consider a verdict in Shajia Ayobi's murder trial. The 46-year-old mother of four was accused of hiring a hitman to kill her husband of 18 years, 53-year-old Ghulam Ayobi.
The prosecution and the defense agreed that Miss Ayobi had orchestrated the death of her husband. They disagreed on the reason that she had done so.
At trial, the prosecution argued that Shajia sought to both end her marriage and collect more than $250,000 in life insurance.
She stood to inherit $285,000 from that policy if her husband died.
But according to the defense, Shajia had orchestrated the murder to end years of abuse at her husband's hands.
She's not a cold-blooded killer. There are circumstances that mitigate what she did that day.
Miss Ayobi asserted that she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and the death of Ghulam was an act of self-defense.
But would the jury agree? On April 30th, 5 days after deliberations began, the jurors sent word to the judge.
They were having a really hard time. They couldn't come to a unanimous decision.
Was a mistrial in the making?
The judge instructs the jury to go back into deliberation and think about it some more.
Or would Shajia's claims of abuse win the jury's sympathy?
They had an option of finding her guilty of something less severe than first-degree murder.
The answer came the next day on May 1st, when the jurors announced that they had finally managed to make a decision.
She was guilty of all charges.
The verdict was a vindication for Ghulam's family and his character.
They truly gave Ghulam justice, made everyone see for who Ghulam was, not what Ghulam was portrayed by Shajia.
But at her sentencing hearing on June 14th, Shajia stood by her abuse claims.
During her sentencing hearing, she recounted her fear that she was going to come home and find that her children were the victims of her husband's abuse and that they would be the ones that ultimately were killed. And that's why she did what she did.
But would her claims have any more impact on the judge than they did on the jury? When she handed down her decision, the judge sentenced Shajia to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 26 years.
I would ask for capital punishment, but definitely life without parole is what we're looking for.
But while Ghulam's family is disappointed with Shajia's sentence, they do take comfort in one thing.
We may forgive her, God may forgive her, and, the authorities may forgive her, but how could she forgive herself? This is something that she's going to have to live with for the rest of her life.
Sonia Mitchell was just a teenager when she met Brian Swartz.
She thought he was everything.
The young couple built a life together and had 3 children.
They were very happy, very loving.
She kind of felt like her life had become complete.
But after 10 years, Sonia would suddenly be a single mother.
Brian Swartz had gone missing. There might have been some foul play involved.
The search for answers would expose all of Brian's secrets.
Brian Swartz apparently made his living by selling drugs.
But the secrets Sonia was keeping would horrify everyone.
Something very violent had happened in that house.
He was gonna set me on fire.
We were like, wow.
And the authorities would be left wondering, was it really foul play?
This mattress was just this stain of blood and tissue and bone.
Or was it justice?
It was either him or her.
I snapped, sir. I don't know what to tell you.
Pueblo, Colorado, September 4th, 2009. It was Labor Day weekend in this blue-collar town of 100,000, an hour and a half south of Denver.
Pueblo's an industrial city, unlike many Colorado cities, because we have a steel mill here.
But there are also plenty of wide-open spaces just outside of town. And one resident, a retired wildlife officer, was dove hunting up on the prairie west of Pueblo when he spotted something curious.
Animals were digging around in the area, which interested him to find out what they were digging up.
He went and began digging a little further and found what he believed to be human remains.
Investigators with the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office were soon on the scene.
We pulled up and the wildlife officer pointed out to me where he had been digging. We walked over to the site where I saw what I appeared to me to be a human skull.
And considering where it was found, how the dead body got there wasn't much of a leap.
It would not be common in any way for a person to be buried in an extremely small, very shallow grave under 2 feet. So you have to suspect that there's potential for foul play.
But before they could figure out just who put the body there, the authorities would have to identify it. which led the investigators at the scene to make a couple of calls. One was to a forensic anthropologist.
A forensic anthropologist uses clues from the skeleton to, first of all, identify somebody or help identify somebody.
The other was to the Pueblo police.
I contacted the Pueblo Police Department investigation sergeant and asked him if he had any missing persons cases they were working.
And the answer the investigator got just might have been the break he needed.
They did have a missing person under some suspicious circumstances.
The Pueblo police were currently investigating the disappearance of 30-year-old Brian Swartz, the victim of an alleged kidnapping.
His girlfriend, Sonia Mitchell, had reported that Brian was taken by some Mexican nationals.
She said they were going to basically, whack him out.
Could the two cases be connected? And if so, did the body in the shallow grave mean the kidnappers had carried out their threat? Or was there another reason that someone would want Brian dead? A secret that only his 24-year-old girlfriend, Sonia, knew. Born in 1985, Sonia Mitchell started life in El Paso, Texas, the middle of three sisters.
Me and Sonia are 3 years apart, and me and Priscilla are 5 years apart.
It wasn't a happy childhood.
Their father was on drugs. I don't know, I kind of gave up there for a while. It was scary, it was depressing, it was frustrating, seeing the abuse. And I didn't know what really was going on or what was happening next.
And when Sonia's father went to prison on drug charges in 1993, Margaret was determined to give her kids a better life.
He had a 3-year sentence. My mom took the opportunity and she left. You see your mom getting hit, it's not right. If somebody talks to you bad, it's not right. I was trying to break the chain.
To make that break, Margaret took the girls to Colorado.
My mom wanted to be with her family, so she moved back to Pueblo, Colorado. I got my apartment, I got a job at the nursing home, and we started doing good.
However, while her mother was able to make a fresh start, the transition was difficult on 10-year-old Sonia, who had a hard time adjusting to her new town and new school.
Sonia felt kind of like an outcast. People look at you different.
And as a result, she formed a tight bond with her younger sister, who was only 8.
Sonia and Priscilla were really close. They always took care of each other.
And eventually they not only adjusted to life in Pueblo, they excelled.
They were ahead in school. They loved it.
Sonia and her sister also did well after school.
I put them in gymnastics, ballet.
But raised by a single mother, they had to help out at home.
I taught the girls to do their own laundry because I was working 2 jobs.
And that was how in 1999, 14-year-old Sonia first met Brian Swartz. 6 years older than Sonia, Brian's family had been in Pueblo for generations.
It's kind of a 6th-generation town where your great-great-grandparents grew up here and now you grew up here, and we were always going on family reunions, and there was probably between 150 to 200 of us.
In his immediate family, Brian was one of 3 brothers.
Brian and his brothers and father were close, worked on cars all the time. They were our family mechanics.
And in 1999, after graduating high school, the aspiring mechanic got his own apartment, which is where he met Sonia.
She was doing the laundry and she met Brian in the laundry room.
She apparently made quite an impression, too.
Brian came over with candy and flowers at the door and he wanted to see Sonia.
But could he win over her mother?
He's begging me to date my daughter. I told him you're too old. What business does a 21-year-old want with my 14-year-old sister? I told him to stay away from her.
But despite being forbidden to see him by her mother, Sonia and Brian's relationship blossomed.
I had to work. So after school, she was meeting him that I didn't know. She thought he was everything. He's older and has a car, and she was easily impressed with all that.
And by the time she was 15, Sonia was pregnant.
And of course, she said she was in love, and she she wanted to have his child.
It appeared that Brian was just as ecstatic, too.
They were very happy. Very, very just excited and very loving.
And despite her family's objections, Sonia moved in with Brian.
As long as she was with Brian, nothing could faze her.
Sonia gave birth to a daughter in 2000 and dropped out of school to take care of her little girl.
Sonia let go of everything, and the baby and Brian were her priority.
And in 2002, at the age of 17, Sonia gave birth to a second daughter.
Brian was a proud father of 2 little girls, and Sonia was a mother raising her 2 children.
And despite her initial objections, Sonia's mother warmed to Brian, and after the birth of her grandchildren, gradually accepted him as part of the family.
They were very happy, I'd say, for the first 2 years. Just normal, you know. Being a couple, taking care of the babies. It was great.
They may have been happy, but the young couple did have some issues to overcome. Despite having 2 children to take care of, Brian seldom held down a regular job.
The only job I knew of Brian having was at Walmart, and he briefly worked for the newspaper.
He did earn some money as a shade tree mechanic.
My grandma had a couple cars fixed by Brian and his dad.
And at one point, Sonia had to take a part-time job to make ends meet.
I worked at Domino's Pizza. I told her, come on out and be my pizza maker.
Although since she dropped out of high school, Sonia had a hard time advancing beyond minimum wage.
She tried several times to get her GED.
But with 2 kids to raise, she struggled to make all the required classes.
She'd get those 2 steps ahead and then she'd be knocked back 3.
And at the age of 20, after getting pregnant with their 3rd child, Sonia put finishing her education on hold once more.
Sonia seemed happy about being pregnant.
Sonia had the baby, a little boy, in 2005.
Brian was over the moon. Brian was ecstatic to have his son, to carry on the last name Swartz.
According to Brian's cousin, Sonia seemed content, too.
She kind of felt like her life had become complete. She had her 2 little girls, and Brian had his little boy, and life was gonna be this happy-go-lucky life from there forward.
And by the time they'd been together nearly 10 years, Sonia and Brian had built a family and seemed to be planning their future. But in reality, was their happy-go-lucky life haunted by a host of dark and deadly secrets? Coming up, the police get an anonymous call about Brian.
They felt like there might have been some foul play involved.
But is there a logical explanation for his disappearance?
It's not illegal to be missing. Some individuals don't want to be contacted.
On August 11th, 2009, the police in Pueblo, Colorado received a curious call concerning Sonia Mitchell's boyfriend.
We got information that a gentleman by the name of Brian Schwartz had gone missing.
Somebody is reporting they hadn't seen Brian Schwartz for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks.
Exactly who reported the 30-year-old mechanic missing remained a mystery.
Crime Stoppers, everybody that calls in is to remain anonymous.
But the caller did say they suspected Brian hadn't just disappeared.
They felt like there might have been some foul play involved.
And when the investigators did a quick check, running Brian's name through their database, it looked as if the caller might have had a point.
He had an extensive history with the Pueblo Police Department. When I was looking into his lifestyle, he had some drug charges.
Brian's rap sheet included charges for possession of marijuana and cocaine, a few distribution arrests, and a few assault charges, though he'd never spent more than a day or 2 in jail. However, the fact that Brian had a record immediately had the investigators wondering, could the Crime Stoppers caller be right? Was Brian's sudden disappearance the result of foul play?
Because of his lifestyle, there's high likelihood of something bad that could have happened.
Especially since he had a history of selling drugs.
Certainly being in the narcotics business like Brian was, that's a very unpredictable lifestyle.
Or Or could it mean there was another explanation for his disappearance? Maybe Brian was simply laying low for some reason.
There's always the possibility that Brian doesn't want to be found.
It's not illegal to be missing. Some individuals don't want to be contacted, and it's not illegal to do that.
Or could he have gone out of town on a drug run? When the investigators ran Brian's vehicle registration, they got the first clue about his possible whereabouts, or at least the whereabouts of his van.
The van was found abandoned on I-25 south of Redto, New Mexico.
Was the abandoned van more evidence of foul play? The authorities in New Mexico didn't think so.
When I spoke with the New Mexico State Police, they said it apparently broke a fan belt and probably overheated, so it was left on the side of the road.
Brian's abandoned van appeared to be a dead end. Running the registration did give them his address, though. But when the investigators went to check it out, it wasn't Brian or Sonia Mitchell, Brian's 24-year-old girlfriend and the mother of his 3 children, who met them at the door.
When I first arrived at the house, I knocked on the door and there was a male by the name of Eloy Varos who answered the door.
He was a friend of the family, according to what he told the investigator.
He had a girlfriend, common law wife, and they had kids. And their kids and Sonia and Brian's kids, they would all play together.
Eloy at the time said that Sonia wasn't there, and as we were speaking, Sonia pulled up in a vehicle.
And when the investigator explained why he was there, that someone had called Crime Stoppers to report Brian missing, Sonia said that was more or less true.
She says that they had gotten into an argument a couple weeks prior to that, and he loaded up a bunch of his stuff in his van and left.
According to Sonia, she hadn't heard from Brian since, and she said that was just fine with her. And his drug dealing wasn't the only reason she was glad he was gone.
She tells me that they did not have a good relationship. There was a lot of domestic violence.
She spelled out some pretty horrific treatment from Brian. At one point, she told us that he had started choking her out and was telling her that he was going to kill her. Then he stopped choking her right when she was about ready to pass out. She said that he looked at her and told her he didn't want to kill her by choking her because when people die like that, they defecate on themselves and they vomit, and he didn't want to have to clean up all her mess.
But if Brian had done such terrible things, could that mean Sonia had something to do with his disappearance?
She reassured me that she still loved him and she would never hurt him.
For the moment, at least until they could verify her claims, the investigators didn't see any reason not to believe her.
I didn't feel like Sonia was overly nervous or anxious by any means. That's why I took what she told me as being truthful.
And when the investigators spoke to Brian's father, he didn't seem all that worried about his son being missing either.
According to the father, he would go missing for weeks at a time.
In fact, according to his father, Sonia wasn't the only one who'd parted with Brian on bad terms.
He tells me that the last time he had seen Brian, they had gotten into an argument, a fairly heated argument about a vehicle that they co-owned together. And I guess Brian had gotten upset and mad and left and hasn't spoke with him since.
Alongside what Sonia had already told them, his father's story had the investigators wondering whether Brian was missing at all.
With those two stories, it sounds like that Brian's just not getting along with a lot of people in his life, and maybe he did choose to put some distance between himself and the people that he seemed to be having rocky relationships with.
And both stories seemed to fit what the investigators already knew about Brian.
He had a history. There was some drug dealing history. He was a violent person.
His volatile past and previous run-ins with the law might have tempted the authorities to simply stop looking into Brian's disappearance.
It's not something that you're going to call out the troops and start searching a grid search somewhere for him.
But there was still that nagging possibility of foul play.
It heightened our awareness a little bit more about the case.
Therefore, the investigators made one final attempt to track down Brian's whereabouts via his cell phone records.
selling illegal drugs, they rely heavily on their phones for their business.
And if Brian was still using his phone, it offered the police a chance to find him.
Cell phone data, not necessarily get an exact location, but you could find a particular cell tower was essentially sort of transmitting data to a particular phone, and based on that tower, you could kind of estimate the location of a particular call.
When the investigators pulled Brian's phone records, it revealed what they expected. The small-time drug dealer all but lived on his phone.
The biggest thing that really stood out to me, there was hundreds and hundreds of hours of use.
Right up to July 27th, approximately 2 weeks before the Crime Stoppers call that kicked off the missing persons case.
From that day on, all that activity stops. That's a huge red flag.
One that sent a loud and clear signal to the investigators.
At that point, we suspected it was a homicide case.
Coming up, Sonia changes her story.
He's in trouble and he needs some money.
And the investigators make a gruesome discovery.
Decomposition is consistent with somebody who hasn't been seen for a month.
By August 27th, 2009, it had been more than 2 weeks since the Pueblo, Colorado Police Department had received an anonymous Crime Stoppers call reporting 30-year-old Brian Swartz missing.
We talked to his father, who said he hadn't heard from him for a few weeks.
And Brian's girlfriend, 24-year-old Sonia Mitchell, said she hadn't seen him either, not since he'd stormed out during an argument.
It appears that him and Sonia had a very rocky relationship because there was many reports of domestic violence type calls.
The rocky relationship could have given Brian a reason to simply leave, but the investigators were starting to wonder if there might be another explanation for why he had apparently abandoned his van and stopped using his phone.
We began to kind of think, well, maybe foul play was involved.
But if so, was Brian's criminal activity to blame?
Brian Swartz apparently made his living by selling drugs. He was selling anything from marijuana to cocaine and using the products himself.
Or could his alleged abuse of Sonia have something to do with it?
Anytime you hear that kind of activity, there could be some motivation for maybe some retaliation.
So that's one of the first things that comes to your mind is, all right, there's some sort of abused spouse or battered woman syndrome.
Not that Sonia had given any indication she might have had anything to do with Brian's disappearance when police questioned her at her house. And when she dropped by the police department on August 27th, she seemed genuinely concerned about him.
She started off by asking me if I had heard from Brian, and I told her I hadn't.
And that's when Sonia dropped a bombshell.
She had said, well, look, I hadn't been 100% honest with you.
According to Sonia, what she told them earlier about Brian leaving after an argument wasn't true, because she'd been reluctant to tell the police what Brian had really been up to.
She then goes into telling me how Brian makes runs to Mexico, picking up drugs, bringing them back to Pueblo and selling them.
And on his latest trip, according to Sonia, Brian had gotten into a serious jam.
She receives a call from him saying that he's in trouble and he needs some money.
There was a big narcotics transaction taking place, and he'd messed that deal up. So he was into these guys for some money.
Sonia said that she tried to round up some cash, but couldn't. And a few days later, Brian had come home, escorted by 4 henchmen of the drug dealer he owed money.
Sonia told us that 4 Mexican nationals showed up at their house, that Brian loaded some of his personal property in his van.
A gun safe that contained several firearms, a large screen TV, some tools, some kind of a refrigerator that she called it a kegerator.
And then, once all the loot had been loaded up, Brian and the drug dealer's henchmen had driven off.
She said that was the last time she'd seen him.
It was a frightening story, but was it true?
His drug dealing background lent a little credence to her story.
And so did the fact that his van had been found ditched along the road between Pueblo and Mexico.
makes sense. It might have been in transit down there, or they may have taken Brian down there.
But when the investigators, hoping to get some clues about the drug dealer's henchmen, went back and spoke to Brian and Sonia's neighbors, one neighbor had seen something quite similar to what Sonia described.
She had seen, I believe, a black Ford Bronco a number of days prior, pulling up with a number of people, loading what appeared to be personal items, to include TV and a large gun safe, into this Ford Bronco and then drive off.
However, according to the neighbor, Brian was nowhere to be seen.
The neighbor says, well, I saw Sonia and some other people loading these items.
And that wasn't all the neighbor had seen either. It turned out that Sonia hadn't been lying when she said Brian had disappeared after a fight.
One of the last times that they had seen Brian, they witnessed Brian and Sonia in a argument, screaming match out in the street, and then it turned physical. Brian was dragging Sonia back to the house by her hair.
That kind of piqued everybody's interest. Maybe, she could have done something, self-defense or something had happened.
But it was a few days later, on September 2nd, when the investigators tried to get back in touch with Sonia, that things really got interesting.
She had moved out of the house.
She had apparently left in a hurry, too.
The cupboards were open. There were, canned goods on the counter. There was clothes thrown about. It's like they were gone, in the middle of the night, and just out the door they went.
The fact that Sonia appeared to be on the run gave new urgency to the investigation into Brian's disappearance. But then, on September 5th, a call to the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office would move the investigation into a disturbing new direction. The call came from a retired wildlife officer who'd been out hunting that morning and stumbled onto a gruesome discovery.
They found possibly human remains buried in rural western Pueblo County.
The remains were badly decomposed, but sheriff's investigators were able to tentatively identify the gender of the deceased.
We were able to determine it was potentially a male.
And hoping for a lead on the dead man's identity, the sheriff's investigators started reaching out to area law enforcement.
You immediately begin looking at missing persons,
which eventually led them to the investigator looking into Brian Swartz's disappearance.
Lieutenant Don Leach contacted me and told me about some remains that were found in a rural area west of Pueblo.
But was it Brian? Hoping for confirmation, the sheriff's investigators brought in a forensic anthropologist to examine the remains.
The decomposition pattern is consistent with somebody who hasn't been seen for a month.
And whoever the dead man was, it appeared that he had been murdered.
There's some peculiar blunt trauma pattern injuries on this cranium. There were 3 impacts that I could identify. There were 2 on the front of the face, and there was 1 just behind the ear.
And when it came to identifying the corpse, the investigators got lucky.
On his hand, there was enough skin that they could get a fingerprint, and they were able to identify the remains as Brian.
5 weeks after he disappeared, the search for Brian had become a homicide investigation.
So obviously Sonia is a potential suspect.
But where was she? Word on the street was that to find her, the police should track down 29-year-old Eloy Varos, a so-called family friend. He'd answered Sonia's door back in August when the police first went looking for Brian.
We've been told they're spending a lot of time together, even to the point that they're living together.
And that left the investigators wondering, was it a new relationship? Or did it have something to do with Brian's death?
When we dug into Brian Swartz's life, we could tell he was a very jealous person, very violent person, not somebody that would put up with another man possibly being with the mother of his children.
Whatever had happened, the investigators were anxious to talk to Eloy, and they would get their chance on September 14th.
He walks into the police department, wanted to talk about the case.
Obviously, the word got out to Eloy that the police were looking for him.
Once Eloy sat down with the investigators, he claimed that he had nothing to hide, opening up about how he knew Brian Swartz.
Eloy even went as far as to tell us that
he would help Brian with his narcotics business.
Brian would bring the loads of marijuana to Pueblo, and Eloy Varos helped him sell their marijuana.
However, Eloy also admitted that he'd gotten more than a little extra cash out of the deal.
Him and Sonia were having sexual relations when Brian was making these narcotics trips to Texas. He was living with Sonia while Brian was gone, and then as soon as Brian would show back up, Eloy's out of the picture.
They just had a love triangle, and Eloy ended up falling for Sonia a little bit more than anybody just messing around with somebody, just a one-time thing, you know what I mean? So he ended up with Sonia.
He wanted to take care of her. He really genuinely cared for her.
And he told the investigators that Brian treated her horribly.
He was a witness to the abuse. He was definitely a witness to the violence that Brian was prone to.
However, he denied having anything to do with Brian's death.
I think he's trying to outsmart us and outthink us, and he's trying to put himself in a position to not get in trouble.
I think he was trying to, in some ways, try to protect Sonia by explaining the violence that Brian was capable of and the violence that he had witnessed.
But if he was trying to protect Sonia and himself, Eloy may have made a serious mistake. At one point in the interview, he made a passing reference to something that immediately caught the investigators' attention.
He gave us a piece of information that, frankly, ended up, making this case just basically turn upside down.
He told us that he had rented a storage unit, and that Sonia had stored some of her property in there.
That was one of those aha moments that, every detective wishes for, and we got it from Eloy.
Because when the investigators got a search warrant for the storage unit, they made a surprising discovery.
Items that she tells us that he had taken with him with the Mexican nationals.
However, the tools, TVs, and other valuables the drug dealer's henchmen had allegedly taken weren't even the most damning thing the investigators found.
We opened up the storage unit and I pulled a mattress out, and there it was. Right on this mattress was just this stain of blood and tissue and bone.
Coming up, Sonia's arrest leads to a tense standoff.
All the cops came, their guns were drawn.
And she makes a startling confession.
I can't live like this no more.
September 14th, 2009, 9 days after finding Sonia Mitchell's boyfriend Brian Swartz buried in a shallow grave outside of town, the Pueblo, Colorado police made a major breakthrough in the case, one that came courtesy of Sonia's lover, Eloy Varos.
It was kind of this weird love triangle going on there.
During an interview with the police, Eloy had accidentally mentioned that he'd rented a storage unit for Sonia.
It wasn't his intention. I think he slipped up. And to be honest, I don't even know that he understood until it was all said and done what exactly he had told us.
We went into the storage shed and searched it, and they found a mattress that appeared to have a large blood stain on it.
As soon as we saw that, we were like, wow.
And the day after finding the mattress, the investigators went to Brian and Sonia's house with another search warrant and a chemical called luminol.
Luminol is used to detect blood that's not necessarily visible to the naked eye.
It will even reveal where blood has been cleaned up. And when the investigators sprayed the chemical in Sonia and Brian's bedroom, the results were astonishing.
We also found what's called cast-off blood on the ceiling.
Something very violent had happened in that house.
The bloody ceiling, coupled with the bloody mattress from the storage unit, led the investigators to an inescapable conclusion.
Obviously, that was the murder scene.
And from there, the investigators moved quickly to take Sonia and Eloy, who'd rented the storage unit, into custody.
Once we find the blood in the house, arrest warrants go out.
But could the investigators find them? It had been almost 2 weeks since Sonia and Eloy had moved out of her house and gone into hiding.
When they left that house, they left in a hurry.
So it was a welcome surprise when shortly after the judge signed her arrest warrant, Sonia and her mother showed up at the storage unit, totally unaware that the police had just searched it.
Obviously, they were there to remove the stuff that was in the storage unit.
While we were getting into the garage, that's when all the cops came, the detectives, their guns were drawn. I was in shock, I didn't know what was going on. They put Sonia in the car, and she was just staring at me and crying. And she told the detectives, take the handcuffs off my mom. She had nothing to do with it.
Sonia had a look of resignation on her face and said that she wanted to talk and tell us the truth about what happened. And she didn't want anybody else to get in trouble.
Taken into custody and brought in for questioning, Sonia didn't deny killing Brian.
She told us that, of course, the story about the Mexican nationals was absolutely not true.
But mostly, she wanted to talk about the abuse she'd suffered over the years.
It was like beating me up every day for it, every day, no matter what I did.
One incident in particular that stands out is he laid out some plastic on the floor of the house, stripped her of her clothes, and so she was naked on this plastic. And he poured some type of accelerant on her.
Roll over the top of my head and told me he was going to set me on fire.
That level of violence, and it was crazy to hear her talk about that.
And yet she never left Brian, who she'd been with since the age of 14.
I loved him so much. I just begged him to be normal, not to hit me, and not to do drugs, to be normal.
He would tell her he would, and then he would go back to the old violent Brian.
Everybody always asks me, why don't you get help? Why don't you go to the cops?
He'd been charged with domestic violence before. Nothing had ever happened. Law enforcement, in her mind, they hadn't done anything to protect her from Brian.
In fact, as Sonia pointed out, the police couldn't even make drug charges stick.
Nobody could touch him. He had a giant record and just did whatever he wanted all of the time.
Sonia said she hadn't considered running away an option either.
And he was always all, I'll kill your family, I'll kill your sister, I'll kill your mom. And I thought even if I ran away and he goes psycho and does kill my mom, how can I live with that? Right?
So according to Sonia, she'd suffered in silence for years.
I can understand how Sonia was so demoralized and mentally abused, physically abused, and just dominated by Brian.
Eventually, though, the discussion turned to the beginning of August 2009.
She said that on the night that he died, Brian was in a particularly foul mood. He told her that he wanted to have sex, and she didn't want to have sex.
I was like, no, get away from me. I don't want to be with him. And he raped me.
She said that once that whole episode of violence was over, he took a bunch of pills, and he went to sleep.
Sonia didn't sleep, however. Instead, she told the police that Brian's brutal rape had been a wake-up call.
Finally, I said, you know what? I can't live like this no more.
Once Brian had passed out, she tells us that she knew that was her opportunity.
I snapped, sir. I don't know what to tell you. I mean,
According to Sonia, while Brian was passed out, she picked up the heaviest thing she could find.
Sonia said that she used a weight bar to beat Brian.
I hit him real hard once, and he was moving, but like he wasn't about. So I hit him again and again. He didn't move no more.
Sonia said that Brian's death had sent her into shock.
I couldn't believe it. I kept waiting for him to get up and to get me, and he didn't. I thought it was like fake, like it wasn't really happening. You know what I mean?
She kind of described to us that it almost felt like she wasn't there. Like it was in a fog or a dream, or she didn't really believe it was taking place.
But eventually, the fact that Brian was really dead had sunk in, leaving Sonia in a dilemma.
I didn't know what to do. So I found the biggest thing I had.
It was a large plastic storage tub, according to Sonia.
I pulled him off the bed and I put him in it and I stuffed him in there.
Then she said that she dragged the storage container into the back of the van and drove it out to the edge of town.
I just pulled over and I started digging, and I got tired, so I just stopped. And I just threw him in there and covered him up and walked away.
Sonia said she was also the one who ditched Brian's van along the roadside in New Mexico.
I drove it by myself, and I drove it, but it broke. Something broke and started smoking. I just tried driving back.
And once back in Pueblo, Sonia said she'd come up with the story about Brian and the Mexican drug dealers in order to cover her tracks.
Right away from the very beginning, everybody believed me. Everybody believed me. Because he had been doing the drug trafficking for so long.
And Eloy, did he have anything to do with the murder? According to Sonia, the only thing he'd done was help her move Brian's things into storage.
Well, Eloy tells us he helped you get rid of Brian?
No, sir. Because he didn't. Nobody helped me.
And while the investigators were moved by what she had been through, they doubted that part of her story, that she had acted alone, was true.
Miss Mitchell was a slight woman, I think 5'5", maybe 120 pounds. Mr. Schwartz was a pretty big guy, 6'5", 2+.
I still had kind of in the back of my mind that, maybe Eloy was involved as well.
But for the moment, Sonia's confession was more than enough to charge her with murder.
To be able to take her statement, match it up with what we were seeing at the crime scene and the stuff we recovered from the storage unit was good for us. It was perfect.
But one question remained. What would a jury make of Sonia's heartbreaking confession? Coming up, Sonia tells her story in court.
There was things I was shocked to hear about.
But will sympathy for what she endured be enough to sway the outcome?
Murder was committed. We can't just look the other way.
August 5th, 2011, it had been almost 2 years since Sonia Mitchell admitted to killing her boyfriend, Brian Schwartz.
She had been physically assaulted and then sexually assaulted by Mr. Schwartz, and as he was sleeping, essentially just bludgeoned him to death.
However, contrary to her confession, Sonia hadn't acted entirely alone. Questioned after Sonia's arrest, her sister Priscilla told police that she, her husband Perry, and Sonia's lover Eloy Varos had all helped dispose of the body.
Sonia confided in Priscilla, and Eloy, Perry, and Sonia end up going over to the house. They do put Brian's body in this tote, like Sonia described.
And by August of 2011, all three had pleaded guilty to accessory to murder charges, and all but Priscilla received 3-year sentences.
Priscilla, in exchange for what she had told us, we gave her a sentence of probation.
But what would Sonia's confession end up costing her?
The first-degree murder could carry a life sentence.
Taking Sonia's case to trial could be risky, though, considering the circumstances.
Sonia exhibited all the signs of a battered spouse.
So in 2011, the prosecutors had offered Sonia a deal.
She agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder,
which left the 26-year-old mother of 3 facing anywhere from 10 to 30 years in prison.
The sentence was essentially left open to the court, or the judge.
And at her sentencing hearing on August 5th, Sonia made a plea for leniency.
She could present her side of the story, essentially offer witnesses and testimony to the nature of her and Brian Schwartz's relationship.
There was a few things I had heard, and a few things I was shocked to hear about.
Some of the incidents of abuse that Sonia described were sickening.
The most heartbreaking one. As he was asking her questions, he would heat this knife up. And if she responded with the wrong answer, that knife went against her back.
And she had the scars to prove it.
I never knew until she stood up in court and showed up.
It's obvious she's a long-time victim of abuse.
Which in the end did stay the judge's hand, at least somewhat.
The court imposed a sentence of 20 years for the charge of second-degree murder.
20 years was a bitter disappointment for Sonia's family.
It was either him or her. That's how she felt. She felt like he was really gonna kill her. Like she had nowhere to go.
Sonia had been through a lot. It should have been a lesser sentence for Sonia, especially with all that abuse.
Perhaps, although the prosecutors disagree.
We all sympathize with what she went through, but at the end of the day, murder was committed. We can't just look the other way on that. Had she just come forward after it happened, obviously she wouldn't have necessarily gotten off, but I think things would have been different for her.
Kimberly Ross had a devout religious upbringing.
She was a good girl, just always singing and, in church.
And her husband, Bill, was just as good-natured.
Kimberly and Bill were people who would take in others who needed help.
People like Ashley Cook and Justin Young.
She was calling Kim mom and calling my brother dad.
Bill took him into his home. He took him on as another child.
One night, Kimberly and Bill's welcoming refuge turned into a crime scene.
They shot my husband!
They shot your husband? Who has shot your husband?
I don't know who they were.
The two intruders just opened the door to the bedroom and began shooting.
Was it a home invasion?
I know a lot of people was alarmed by that and scared by that.
Was it vengeance?
Kim really made him believe that she was being hurt and that he had to save her.
Or had the good girl gone bad?
Kimberly Ross was a pathological liar.
Shelbyville, Tennessee, February 14th, 2007. It was a little after 2 a.m. in this quiet country town an hour south of Nashville.
Shelbyville is small. It's a rural southern town. Everybody kind of knows everybody, and everybody knows kind of everybody's business.
And everybody in Shelbyville was about to be shot.
It's County 911.
She was hysterical. The 911 operator had extreme difficulty understanding her.
The caller was 37-year-old Kimberly Ross.
Ma'am, you need to calm down so I can understand you.
But when she finally managed to make herself understood, it instantly became clear why Kimberly was so hysterical.
They shot my husband!
They what?
Shot my husband!
Who has shot your husband?
I don't know who they were.
Did they come in your house and do this?
Yes, sir.
She's been a victim of a home invasion, and her husband's been shot and is clinging to life.
Is your husband breathing?
You can tell that Mr. Ross is still alive because she's actually yelling at him to lay still, to be still.
Please, lay down. Lay down. Lay down. Please. Put no bed. Lay down.
But his condition was dire.
There's a lot of blood. Oh my God, a lot of blood.
Deputies from the Bedford County Sheriff's Office rushed to the scene.
So I was pretty close by, about 2:15 when the call came out.
And when they arrived, they found 19-year-old Justin Young lying near the front door, his hands and feet bound with baling twine.
He was living with the Rosses. He was friends with them through Kimberly's son.
He was yelling for help.
Kimberly was further inside the house, her hands and feet bound with an electrical cord.
She was tied around her hands with her hands in front, and the same cable ran down to her feet, and it was wrapped around her feet.
She had managed to get to a cell phone, to make the call.
And Kimberly's husband, 40-year-old Bill Ross, was in the bedroom.
Despite the horrific nature of his wound, he was still alive.
He was breathing, and I could hear him making noise.
With Bill clinging to life, the EMTs loaded him into the back of the ambulance, while sheriff's deputies started going over the crime scene, looking for anything that might help identify the two home invaders.
We were looking for any evidence, a weapon that may have been used, a firearm, anything that would connect the dots that way.
But for the moment, all they knew was that they had a very unusual crime on their hands.
We had a victim with multiple gunshot wounds. We had 2 subjects that lived there that were tied up.
And the investigation would soon focus on what was happening inside the home of Bill and Kimberly Ross.
It's a situation where you want to know what's the rest of the story.
Born in 1969, Kimberly Ballman grew up in a small Indiana town, raised by a family of devout Pentecostal Christians.
Kim was a little church girl, long skirts, long dark hair, just always singing and, in church. She was a good girl.
But when Kim was a teenager, the family moved to Oklahoma, and soon after, the good girl rebelled against her religious upbringing.
Stories from the family is she was sleeping around. She got kicked out because she got knocked up.
Only 19, Kimberly married before giving birth to a son in 1989, but the marriage didn't last.
She had one child. He was somewhere around the age of 2.
Barely in her 20s and desperate to support her child, Kimberly found work as an exotic dancer, which was how she first met William Galloway, although at first he didn't realize she was a stripper.
Me and some buddies, we were just kind of watching the girls and talking and drinking. This girl was sitting at the bar in a nice, expensive evening dress. We didn't know who she was. I said, hey, let's put some money up and see if we can get her to get on stage, take that dress off. Well, I guess the trick was on us because she acted like she'd never done this before. But thought the money was nice, so she got up there and she actually stripped for us. And I didn't find out later that she actually worked there.
Discovering that he'd been played didn't do anything to deter William, though.
And I asked her out and we started dating. And then she got pregnant. So I asked her to marry me.
Kimberly said yes, but their happiness would be put to the test by complications shortly after the birth of their daughter, Billy.
I had a fever when I was like a week old. I was in the hospital.
Something attacked her brainstem. On one side of her tongue, she don't have control of the muscles. We had to take her to all kinds of hospitals and doctors.
And when it was clear that their daughter would survive, the relieved parents got married. And 2 years later, the couple also had a son, Kimberly's 3rd child.
We did pretty good. We lived out on some acreage and did stuff together. I would say for the first 5 or 6 years, we were really happy.
But things changed after Kimberly convinced William to give her the money to buy a friend's bar.
We grew apart after she bought the bar. I was just losing money hand over fist in it.
The business eventually failed, and soon after, Kimberly's husband filed for divorce, kicking off a bitter custody dispute over their 2 children.
My divorce got so ugly that I hired a lawyer, but the judge awarded her custody.
And things were still being finalized in 2004 when Kimberly's uncle died, and the 35-year-old went home to Indiana with her children for his funeral.
Me and my brother and my mom drove up there, and then I remember after the funeral we went to eat with someone, and it was Bill.
38-year-old Bill Ross, who'd known Kimberly since they were kids. 3 years older than Kimberly, when Bill was 15, his mother died, and the teenager moved in with Kimberly's uncle, Andy.
He was a good person. He pretty much shaped Bill, I think.
Bill wasn't all that close to Kimberly, though, since she moved to Oklahoma soon after, and her uncle's funeral was the first time she'd seen Bill in years.
We went to eat with Bill, and they were talking like they'd been friends.
She was happy to see Bill.
Bill was pretty happy to see her, too.
They were both all over each other at the bar after her uncle's funeral.
They apparently made a deeper connection, because after the funeral, when Bill went back to Tennessee, where he'd been living for nearly 10 years, Kimberly soon followed.
She moved to Tennessee like within days.
And within months, once Kimberly's divorce was final, she and Bill were married.
It's like, this is it, I really like her. I think we're going to do this.
After the wedding, Bill and Kimberly settled into a house he bought on the outskirts of Shelbyville, not far from the car dealership where he worked.
He was the top salesman, I want to say, for 3 consecutive years.
He was the breadwinner. Kimberly didn't earn an income.
But she wasn't a stay-at-home mom either. After Kim and her ex-husband agreed to a custody arrangement to avoid uprooting the kids, Kimberly's 2 youngest children stayed behind in Oklahoma with their father. And while her oldest son, who was almost 16, did come to Tennessee with his mother, he soon moved out on his own.
He was not living in the home at the time, but he was a frequent visitor on weekends, things like that.
However, Kimberly and Bill weren't exactly empty nesters. By 2007, they'd taken in a friend of her son's, 19-year-old Justin Young.
Justin had a difficult time dealing with the divorce between his parents and had a difficult time dealing with his stepdad.
And Bill, perhaps remembering the kindness Kimberly's uncle had shown him, was more than willing to let Justin stay with them.
Bill took him into his home. He took him on as another child.
So did Kimberly.
Kim doted on Justin like that was her son.
Before long, Justin acted like one, too.
Justin called Kim Mom.
And that suited Kimberly just fine, since having Justin around the house also filled the void left when her youngest children opted to stay in Oklahoma.
She had this need to be some kind of a mother figure.
She had a need to be accepted by someone. She needed something to call family.
Justin wasn't the only member of her surrogate family either. There was also 23-year-old Ashley Cook.
She was somewhat of a transient. She lived several different places, was not working.
She'd also been arrested a few times for possession of marijuana.
She had misdemeanor stuff that, you don't want to see on a young person's record, but you're not really shocked when you do.
Nevertheless, when a friend introduced Kimberly and Bill to Ashley, the older couple decided to help out the troubled young woman.
Kimberly was paying her bills and giving her money to keep her up.
My brother helped pay for a place for her to live.
And while Ashley didn't live with Kimberly and Bill, it was evident that she considered them family.
She was calling Kim Mom and calling my brother Dad.
But on Valentine's Day 2007, after a brutal attack that left her husband fighting for his life, the authorities would be asking, did Kimberly's need to take care of others lead to a tragic betrayal? Coming up, the investigators questioned Justin and Kimberly about the home invasion.
Justin reported that he woke up to discover a black male holding a gun to his head.
But will the evidence say otherwise?
There were minute details that didn't match up.
After 2 o'clock on the morning of Valentine's Day 2007, the Bedford County, Tennessee 911 Center received a frantic call from 37-year-old Kimberly Ross.
She's been a victim of a home invasion, and her husband's been shot and is clinging to life.
Is your husband breathing?
A lot of blood. Oh my God, a lot of blood. A lot of blood.
Within minutes, deputies arrived at the Ross home just outside Shelbyville, Tennessee.
When you enter the house, it's weapons drawn. I mean, we were told on dispatch that the 2 assailants had left the scene, so obviously we have to clear the residence.
Inside the house, the deputies found Kimberly and 19-year-old Justin Young, who lived with the Rosses. Both had been tied up.
Justin was tied with string like you might bale hay with.
Kimberly had been tied with some type of a cord, electrical cord.
It was loose enough for her to get a cell phone and make a phone call to 911.
Kimberly's husband, 40-year-old Bill Ross, was in the bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head.
It appeared there was gray material oozing from the wound, which would obviously be brain matter.
So without a minute to lose, the EMTs loaded Bill onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance.
You're changing the scene and possibly destroying evidence, but that's just something that has to be done. I mean, the human life is way more important than the investigation.
And a life flight helicopter from Nashville was already en route, even as the EMTs rushed Bill to the local hospital.
They have a helipad there, so they would go to the helipad and then meet the helicopter there.
But by the time Bill reached the helipad, it was too late.
He passed away in the back of the ambulance.
Bill Ross Ross was dead, and in an instant, the focus shifted from saving his life to solving his murder.
I had deputies take the scene off because the crime actually was committed in the house. I mean, there's evidence possibly outside the house, and also to keep people away from the scene as well.
And while the crime scene tape went up outside the house, Kimberly and Justin were inside, giving sheriff's deputies a detailed account of the attack.
The assailants were described as two unknown black males who had apparently crawled in through a window.
The window was in Justin's room.
Justin reported that he was asleep in bed. He woke up to discover a black male holding a gun to his head and another one tying him up.
He said that one of the males came to his room that was armed, held him at gunpoint and told him that if he would be still, be quiet, that he would be okay, he would not be harmed.
Meanwhile, according to Kimberly, she had been in the living room watching television.
The first moment she's aware there's a problem is when Justin Young is being escorted down the hallway with the two intruders armed with guns. They tie her up and basically shove her to the floor.
Kimberly said that based on what she'd overheard, the two men were looking for someone.
She stated that she had heard the name. They were looking for William and Jimmy.
She didn't know who William and Jimmy were, except her husband's name is Bill. She said that she had no idea why they were there, who they were, what they were upset about.
And she had no explanation for what the two men did next.
They then inexplicably just opened the door to the bedroom where Mr. Ross was asleep and began shooting.
Kimberly said that the killers had fled after the shooting.
We did not know what their mode of transportation was, whether it was on foot, whether they had left in a vehicle or what.
But that all changed once the investigators escorted Kimberly out of the house to take her down to the station for a formal statement.
Once I got her outside the house, she immediately started screaming, "My car, my car. They took my car."
Was it the break that could lead investigators to the killers?
We get a description of the car, got on the radio, boloed that to other officers to be on the lookout for that vehicle.
And that wasn't the only clue the investigators had to work with either. Outside the house, they found something that seemed to confirm Justin's story about the intruders coming in the window.
They noticed here's a stepladder outside Justin Young's window.
And processing the bedroom, crime scene technicians made an important discovery about the murder weapon.
There were a couple of shell casings on the floor at the foot of the bed. They were .380 casings.
But elsewhere in the house, they made another puzzling discovery.
There's a gun cabinet in the living room with a door open, and they discovered there was a box of .380 ammunition in there, but they did not see a .380 caliber weapon. Is it a coincidence that Mr. Ross was shot with a .380 pistol?
After all, according to what Justin told the investigators, the killers didn't need to shoot Bill with his own gun.
The facts that they were told was that both assailants were already armed when Justin Young was awakened.
If Justin was right, why would the killers take one of Bill's guns?
We had no idea what we were looking at. Was this a drug deal gone bad? Was this an old vendetta over something else? We had no clue.
What they did know was that something wasn't adding up, so investigators turned to their two witnesses. It was 6 o'clock that morning before the investigators were finally able to sit down with Kimberly and Justin to take their formal statements.
They were transported to the hospital, checked out, and then brought to the sheriff's department.
And ushered into separate interrogation rooms. They each gave essentially the same account of the shooting that they'd given at the scene.
Kimberly and Justin repeated the story of this home invasion.
However, the investigators soon noticed something about their individual stories.
They told basically the same story, substance, but there were minute details that didn't match up.
They had some discrepancies in the description of the perpetrators, what they were wearing, some of the sequence of events.
Of course, a certain amount of discrepancy was expected.
You get that when you have people that have been subjected to a traumatic event.
Especially someone like Kimberly, who just lost her husband.
She seemed a little shaken by it all. There was a little bit of like a bewilderment type look.
Justin, on the other hand, didn't look bewildered.
He just seemed like a very nervous young man.
So, already suspicious of his claim that both intruders had been armed when they came in his window, one of the investigators brought Justin back into the interrogation room for a second interview.
We went in and told Justin Young, that essentially that he just didn't believe him, that, there were a lot of inconsistencies between what he and Kimberly were saying. There were a lot of inconsistencies between what he was saying and the physical evidence.
He got caught in a web of his own words.
And once tangled in it, he tried to talk his way out.
At that point, Justin did change his story.
In fact, Justin didn't just change his story. He started naming names, including a name the investigators had yet to hear.
Justin broke and said that Ashley's the one that done the shooting. She's the one that killed him.
Coming up, the investigators bring Ashley in for questioning.
It was not a plausible story. It didn't add up.
And that leads to a shocking accusation.
Kimberly led Ashley to believe that Bill had been abusing Kimberly.
On Valentine's Day 2007, Kimberly Ross's husband of 2 years, Bill Ross, had been shot to death in his home outside Shelbyville, Tennessee.
Kimberly said that two black males had entered the home, shot her husband, and tied her and Justin up and left.
And at first, 19-year-old Justin Young, who lived with the Rosses, had told a somewhat similar story.
A lot of their facts were similar, but they had some details that were different.
Suspicious, the investigators had brought Justin in for a second round of questioning, and the result was a breakthrough.
He figured he's telling a lie, it's not going to hold up any further, and so he needs to start telling the truth. So Justin's next version was that this home invasion by two unknown assailants was bogus.
Instead, Justin said that it was Ashley Cook who'd killed Bill.
That's the first time we'd heard the name Ashley.
Ashley's name may have been new to the homicide investigators, but she was no stranger to the victim. Another troubled young person like Justin, Ashley didn't live with Kimberly and Bill, but she did depend on their generosity.
The Rosses provided financial support,
including the trailer outside Shelbyville where Ashley lived.
They paid the rent, they paid the utilities, things like that.
So why would she kill the Golden Goose? It was simple, according to Justin.
Bill Ross was going to cut it all off.
Justin said that Bill's decision must have made Ashley furious, because she was the one who'd actually crawled in his window early that morning.
Ashley came over, came through the window, came down the hall, grabbed the gun out of the cabinet, chambered around, and then shot Mr. Ross.
According to Justin, Ashley's the one that came up with the story about the gentleman breaking in, and she tied him up and told him, "This is the story you tell."
But if that were true, why would Justin and Kimberly actually tell that story once the sheriff's deputies arrived? Hoping for an answer, the investigators brought Kimberly back in for another round of questioning.
Kimberly says that she lied in the first statement because she was afraid of Ashley.
And like Justin, Kimberly said Ashley had murdered Bill because he decided to stop supporting her financially.
I do recall Kimberly saying Ashley got mad at Bill, and that was her reasoning for shooting him.
However, while Kimberly and Justin's new stories essentially matched, the investigators didn't necessarily believe them.
Why would you have told that in the first place? To say that you're afraid, well, now you've got a bunch of police officers, you're going to be safe from that point. Why aren't you pointing law enforcement in the direction of the person who did it?
It was not a plausible story. It didn't add up.
And yet, at just after 7:30 that morning, while the investigators were finishing up with Kimberly and Justin, patrol officers made a discovery that appeared to confirm at least some of their story: Kimberly's stolen car.
It was abandoned in a church parking lot, about a half a mile or so from Ashley's house.
Had Kimberly and Justin actually actually been telling the truth?
The vehicle was basically clean. There was no weapons. There was nothing that was tied back to the crime scene.
However, even without the murder weapon, finding the car so close to Ashley's trailer was enough to send the deputies looking for her.
They got her and brought her to the sheriff's department.
And without telling her right away that Justin and Kimberly had accused her of murder, they asked Ashley what she knew about Kimberly's car.
At which time she basically started telling a story that Kimberly had given her the car and told her to take it.
And Bill's murder. According to Ashley, she'd had nothing to do with it.
She was told at that point, look, Justin and Kimberly have ratted you out. They have pointed the finger at you and said that you alone did this.
The news appeared to take Ashley by surprise.
She became quite emotional. She felt like she had been sold out by Justin and Kimberly.
And in her anger about the betrayal, Ashley ended up making a damning admission.
She's now saying that this was a conspiracy involving myself, Justin Young, Kimberly Ross.
Although according to Ashley, Kimberly was the mastermind.
Ashley said Kimberly had put her up to do this.
She was given $30 and was told she could keep the car for murdering Bill Ross.
Ashley claimed that the money and the car weren't the main reasons she'd done it, though.
Kimberly led Ashley to believe that Bill had been abusing Kimberly.
Kimberly said she couldn't get a divorce because she would be left with nothing, and so the plan was hatched that she would come over and commit the murder.
However, according to Ashley, that wasn't the entire plan.
They had conspired to basically blame a couple of young black men as the perpetrators.
Not just in a generic sense either. Ashley said they'd planned to set up two men she knew.
They'd hung out together, done drugs before, things like that.
And on the night of February 13th, Ashley had invited the two men to come to her trailer.
They drove over, was hanging out with her. She said, I've got to go take care of something. Y'all just hang out. I'll be back shortly.
Ashley told the investigators that she'd taken a cab to the convenience store, not far from Kimberly's house.
So then she walked to the Ross house. She told how there was a stepladder outside. She climbed up the stepladder that was left in place through the window. Justin had previously loaded the gun, chambered around, and wiped it down so there would be no fingerprints on it.
He loaded the gun because she didn't know how to use it. She had never fired a weapon, or I doubt maybe that she had even held a weapon prior to that night.
Then she claims she just opened the door without even looking, sticks her arm in the doorway, and fires 3 or 4 shots.
And after shooting Bill, according to Ashley, she'd tied up Kimberly and Justin, but not too tight.
Kimberly was left in a situation to where she could make a phone call, a 911 call.
Although by then, Ashley was supposed to have carried out the rest of their plan.
It was her intention to give the vehicle with the gun in it to the 2 black males that she left at her house.
They'd be driving through town about the time they'd be on the lookout, and they would get picked up, questioned, find a murder weapon, dead man's car, and deflect any further investigation on their end.
At least that was what was supposed to happen. But according to Ashley, when she got back to the trailer, the plan to frame 2 innocent men for murder had quickly gone awry.
When she returned, they were gone. She didn't know what to do. She left the car at the church. She walked back to the house.
But according to Ashley, before ditching the car, she had decided to hang on to the gun.
She had told them that it was under the mattress.
And the .380 caliber pistol was still there when the investigators searched her trailer a few hours later.
It all come apart so fast that by the time we got to her, she hadn't had time, really, to get rid of the weapon.
The gun was enough hard evidence to place Ashley under arrest for murder.
It matched the shell casings found at the scene.
But it didn't prove her account that Kimberly and Justin had been involved.
The determination was made to go back and talk to each one of them again.
And since Justin had been the first one to break last time around, the investigators started with him.
he would be the most likely to cooperate and tell the truth. And sure enough, Justin does. He agrees that this is a conspiracy.
And according to Justin, he'd gotten involved in the murder plot for pretty much the same reason as Ashley.
She told Justin that my brother was abusing her.
Kim really made him believe that she was being hurt and that he had to save her.
Although according to Justin, when Kimberly brought up killing Bill, he tried to talk her out of it, at least initially.
He had urged Kimberly to get a divorce. She responded that she would be left with nothing if she went through a divorce.
But if Bill died, there would be much more.
She said that there was $1 million life insurance policy.
He was promised that she would move to Oklahoma and he would move with her and they would live on a ranch.
When the investigators brought Kimberly back in for another round of questions and confronted her with what they'd learned from Justin and Ashley, she didn't deny it.
She was pretty open about being involved in a conspiracy to have Bill murdered.
And she fully backed up everything that Justin and Ashley said about Bill's alleged abuse.
Kimberly stated that he had raped her that morning of the murder.
And it was hardly the first time, according to Kimberly.
Her statement begins with literally, Bill Ross is a horrible individual who has raped me. He has beat me. He has bruised me. He has burned me.
Which in Kimberly's mind meant that Bill had gotten what he deserved.
She's admitting that she was involved in a plan to murder her husband, claiming I'm justified in what I did.
But would a jury see it that way? At the end of her third round of questioning, the investigators placed Kimberly under arrest for murder.
She was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and first-degree murder.
And so were Justin and Ashley.
It clearly involved these three people.
But was there another person involved in the story? Another name that the investigators hadn't heard yet. Coming up, Bill's sister makes an unexpected discovery.
I called the number and he said, "Who the hell is this?"
But will it reveal a new motive?
They had been engaged to be married for approximately 5 years.
By the afternoon of February 16, 2007, it had been less than 48 hours since Kimberly Ross's husband Bill had been murdered in their home outside Shelbyville, Tennessee.
The story was given that it was a home invasion. These two fellas came in, shot Bill, and escaped.
But within hours, Bedford County Sheriff's investigators had arrested 37-year-old Kimberly, 19-year-old Justin Young, and 23-year-old Ashley Cook for Bill's murder.
This is definitely not a home invasion. It was reported that way to start with, and I know a lot of people was alarmed by that and scared by that, and justifiably, but that's not the case.
Kimberly was the main actor in this. It was Kimberly Ross that put them on a path to murdering Bill Ross.
Who pulled the trigger?
Ashley.
The other woman?
Yes, I was trying to. They saw him abusing me and they couldn't take it no more.
According to what Justin had told the investigators, Bill's alleged abuse and his $1 million insurance policy had motivated the murder. But after doing a little digging, the investigators had their doubts.
Mr. Ross had a life insurance policy of $25,000.
And they suspected Kimberly's claims of abuse were also a lie.
In doing the background with co-workers, family, associates, I couldn't find anybody that had anything bad to say about Bill Ross.
Not one single person ever reported that he had a temper, or that he was an angry person, or that anything like that.
But if Bill wasn't abusive and there was no $1 million payoff, what motivated the crime? The first clue would come that afternoon, but it wouldn't be the investigators who found it. By 2 days after the murder, on the 16th, the investigators had finished gathering evidence at Bill and Kimberly's house.
After they released the crime scene, Bill's family were allowed in there to collect his things.
And while Bill's sister Tammy was packing his personal effects, she heard a cell phone.
I looked around and it kept going off, and we found it underneath some clothes on the dresser top.
It wasn't Bill's phone, though.
I already had his phone that he had laid on the bedside table, and I knew it wasn't it.
She had found Kimberly Ross' cell phone.
And since the sound that led her to it indicated an incoming text, Tammy looked at the log and discovered a series of recent messages.
They were saying, "Sweetheart, where are you? You know, I'm waiting at the airport." I called the number and I said, "Who is this?" And he said, "Who the hell is this?"
And when Tammy explained that Kimberly was in jail, under arrest for murdering her husband, the man on the phone became even more confused.
He said, "Her husband." I said, "The murder of her husband." And he said, "Wait a minute, she's my fiance." He was calling from Oklahoma, and he said that they were engaged to be married and that he was supposed to pick her up at the airport that morning, and she was moving there.
Law enforcement talked to him, and we got a really complete picture of the kind of person we're dealing with Kimberly Ross.
The man told the investigators that he'd known Kimberly for years, back when she'd lived in Oklahoma, and that they'd gotten engaged before she moved to Tennessee.
They had been engaged to be married for approximately 5 years.
Kimberly's fiance said he'd been expecting Kimberly to move back to Oklahoma to join him, but that she'd kept putting things off because of her oldest son.
Kim had told him she was trying to get custody back of him, and so she was traveling from Tennessee to Oklahoma all the time.
And what about Bill Ross? Kimberly's fiance told the investigators that he knew the name. He even knew that Kimberly had been living with him, but he'd never heard anything about them being married.
He had no clue. He thought that Bill Ross was Kimberly's cousin.
However, according to the fiancé, their long-awaited wedding was finally supposed to be happening, which explained all the frantic texts about waiting at the airport.
On the 14th, she was planning on flying out of Nashville back to Oklahoma, and they were going to be married and live happily ever after.
Was the future husband waiting in the wings Kimberly's true motive for murdering Bill?
I believe Kimberly's motive was simply she wanted out of the marriage.
And while there was no $1 million insurance policy, there was money at stake. Cash Kimberly was getting from her Oklahoma fiancé.
I found all kinds of Western Union receipts from the fiancé from Oklahoma.
He was paying Kimberly's bills. He was sending her quite a bit of money, anywhere from $400 to $600 a week for her upkeep.
Small sums that eventually added up to some serious cash.
He had apparently sent her more than $100,000 over the years.
But was he also involved in Bill's murder? After interviewing the fiancé, the investigators concluded that the answer was no.
There's no doubt in my mind that he would have been the next victim, eventually.
Nor would he be the first person Kimberly had tricked out of money. Digging into her background, the investigators uncovered a laundry list of various frauds and schemes that she'd perpetrated back in Oklahoma.
She claimed that she was a pastor of a church. She claimed a lot of things that just weren't true.
And she had even been arrested for once impersonating a police officer.
She had a uniform. She had an ID that showed she was a police officer.
Kimberly Ross was a pathological liar.
And she'd had no trouble convincing Ashley and Justin to go along with her plot to kill Bill.
Justin believed that Kim was being abused. Kim kept feeding him that line.
But was that Justin's only motive?
The way she doted on him, it wasn't a natural relationship that you would have with your best friend's mother.
There was a suggestion, that she and Justin engaged in sexual activity.
It wasn't true, according to Kimberly.
She vehemently denied any of that.
And as she and her attorney prepared for trial, Kimberly confidently stood by her claims of abuse.
She had a sense that it was a winnable case, that she wouldn't be convicted of first-degree murder.
But was she right? Could she pull off an acquittal? After all, she'd already been able to convince people that she was a pastor and even a cop.
She could manipulate people easy.
So was it unreasonable to think that she could convince a jury that she'd been abused?
If so, then maybe she did decide to kill her husband, out of some need to get away from that.
Or would it turn out that Kimberly had one more surprise in store for everyone? Coming up, can the prosecution convince Justin to take the stand?
We made no promises to him whatsoever.
Or will Kimberly's power of manipulation prove decisive?
They played right into her hand.
On Wednesday, November 7th, 2007, Kimberly Ross walked into the Marshall County Courthouse in Lewisburg, Tennessee. It had been almost 9 months since the 38-year-old had been arrested for masterminding the murder of her husband, Bill.
She was laying the foundation for this story that my brother abused her, trying to get people to believe it, months before she killed him.
And according to the prosecution, she'd recruited 19-year-old Justin Young and 24-year-old Ashley Cook to help her carry out her deadly plan.
She was very manipulative. They were young, impressionable, and they played right into her hand.
But since Kimberly was the alleged key to the conspiracy, the prosecutors had decided to put her on trial first.
They had a very good case, but not an exceptionally strong case.
Kimberly vowed to fight the charges, but as the trial date approached, something happened that made her reconsider.
Justin turned state's evidence.
When we met with Justin, we made no promises to him whatsoever. If you want to cooperate, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I believe Justin Young was sincerely remorseful that he had decided to become involved in this.
And his testimony could be very damaging to Kimberly's claims of abuse.
He never saw any of that. He lived there. He said he saw no signs of that. He certainly never overheard an angry word between them.
But would he ever take the stand? When Kimberly found out that the prosecution had been talking to Justin, her reaction was immediate.
She just basically threw her hands up and said, well, it's over then. So then I called the DA and we worked out a deal fairly quickly.
And when Kimberly went to court on November 7th, it was to plead guilty to first-degree murder.
The judge accepted her guilty plea and sentenced her to life with possibility of parole. Kimberly has to serve 51 calendar years before she's up for parole.
The police and prosecutors were satisfied that justice had been served.
She was a very cold, calculated killer. She was 100% a part of this. She may not have pulled the trigger, but she might as well have.
Bill's sister is satisfied too, but that doesn't make the murder's aftermath any easier.
We're supposed to pray for our enemies. And I can do that with the woman that shot my brother, but I have to this day no sense of forgiveness in my heart for Kim.
And perhaps most telling of all, neither does Kimberly's own daughter.
My mom was evil. She didn't care who she had and didn't have no feelings for anyone but herself.